The consonance meter should not have been moving, and it was moving. Reth watched the needle climb through a band the instrument was not built to read, past the line the manufacturers had painted red because no VRAC the technician was ever supposed to see the needle reach it, and then past the edge of the dial entirely, where there were no numbers at all because no one had imagined a subject producing a resonance that large. The meter ticked against its own housing. A small sound, patient, mechanical. Tick, tick, like a knuckle on a door that would not open. On the shaping cradle below the observation gallery, the human lay still. He was not supposed to be still. That was the first wrong thing, before the meter, before any of it. At this point in a shaping, the subject convulsed. The strain went in and the body understood, in some deep chemical grammar older than any language, that it was being unmade, and the body fought the unmaking with everything it had until it had nothing left, and then it stopped fighting, and then the shaping began. Every subject Reth had ever cradled had passed through that gate screaming. The Vraktha did. The Asenmer did, and the four-armed Theldun, and the gray soft-bodied Kale they had bought by the crate-load before the Kale proved too fragile to hold a soldier's shape. All of them screamed, and then all of them broke, and the ones that survived the breaking got up as cadre. The human did not scream. His jaw was set. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling plate above the cradle, and he breathed, slow, deliberate, drawn down long and let out longer, as though he were doing a thing he had decided to do rather than a thing being done to him. "Reading fault," said Overseer Valsetha without turning from the glass. "Recalibrate the instrument." "The instrument calibrated at the start of the cycle, Overseer." Reth kept his voice level. "It agrees with the secondary column and the tertiary." "Then all three are faulted." Valsetha's crest lay flat against the back of his skull, which in a Vraktha of his rank meant nothing at all. He had trained the display out of himself decades ago. A subject does not consonate at that magnitude. The lattice does not permit it. "Recalibrate, or bring me a technician who can." Reth did not recalibrate. He looked down through the glass at the young man on the cradle and he understood, with the cold, clean drop of a physician who has just watched a certainty die, that the instruments were correct and the doctrine was wrong. They had taken the human 11 days earlier from a salvage tug drifting powerless at the edge of the Ambrite fields. The tug had been stripped, its crew scattered to the labor markets, and the human, young, unremarkable, one of 4 the raiders had pulled from the wreck, had been sold to the Institute at Halakvor as substrate. That was the word on the manifest. Substrate. Raw material for the 9th shaping. Reth had signed for him the way he signed for all of them, a hooked stroke of the stylus, and had not looked twice at the manifest image because the manifest images never mattered. What mattered was the world the substrate came from, and this one came from a world the Vraktha catalog ranked at the top of a very short and very unpleasant list. Ordeal tier, ashfall gradient 9. A world of crushing gravity swings and lethal atmospheres and predators that hunted in the dark. A world whose native life had spent its entire evolutionary history being killed in creative ways and refusing, generation after generation, to stay killed. The Vraktha did not build soldiers from soft worlds. They built them from hard ones, and there was no world in the surveyed volume harder than the one that had made the young man on the cradle. That was why the 9th shaping had been assigned a human. The Institute was dying. Reth knew it the way a physician knows the smell of a wound gone bad early, quietly, before anyone will say the word aloud. The cadre they shaped now came off the cradles brittle. Obedient, yes. The strain still installed obedience the way it always had, wrote command into the marrow so deep that a cadreborn would walk into fire on a word and never slow. But something had thinned in them over the generations. The strain had been refined and refined and refined again, until it produced a soldier so pure of purpose that there was nothing left in him but the purpose. And a soldier who is only purpose, it turned out, is a soldier who cannot improvise, cannot endure a surprise, cannot hold a line when the plan dies. At the front against the Sul, Whole cadre columns had stood in perfect formation and been slaughtered, because no one had told them what to do when the thing that was happening was not the thing they had been shaped to expect. The Institute had been given one more chance to fix this. One more shaping, from the hardest substrate in the catalog, to prove that the doctrine still worked if only the raw material was strong enough. If the human broke and rose as cadre, the program lived. If he died on the cradle like the kale, the program died with him, and Valsetha with it, and Reth, and everyone in the gallery who had spent their careers learning to make soldiers out of people. So it mattered a great deal that the human was not breaking. "Cycle time," Reth said. The junior at the column, a nervous shaping physician third rank named Osk, answered without being asked twice. 9 hours past introduction, physician. The strain is fully seated. Distribution is total. By every prior curve he should be. Osk stopped. Started again. By every prior curve the breaking should have concluded 4 hours ago. And the consonants? Still climbing. Osk's voice did something small and frightened at the edges. It doesn't fall, physician. In every prior subject it spikes at the breaking and then falls as the old self dies out. His only climbs. Reth had cradled 200 and some subjects across 19 years. He had learned to read the consonants meter the way a hunter reads a track. The number measured, in the Institute's own fond metaphor, how loudly the subject's old self was arguing with the strain, the resonance of a body insisting on remaining what it was. It always spiked at the gate. Then the argument ended because the old self lost, and the number fell to nothing, and out of the nothing they built the soldier. The human's argument was not ending. His body had met the thing designed to unmake it, and instead of losing the argument, it was getting louder. "Overseer," Reth said, "I recommend we suspend the cycle and observe." "You recommend?" Valsetha turned from the glass at last. He was old, older than Reth by 2 full generations, his hide the deep slate of the high castes gone nearly black at the joints with age, and his eyes when they found Reth were flat and patient and entirely without mercy. "The 9th shaping does not suspend. It concludes. It concludes with a cadre born on the cradle or a corpse on it, and either outcome is a result the marshal's office can read. What the marshal's office cannot read, physician, is a subject who lies on the cradle for a further cycle doing nothing while 3 faulted instruments insist he is singing loudly enough to crack the glass. Conclude the shaping. Advance the seat." Reth looked at Osk. Osk looked at the floor. "Advancing the seat this early has a mortality," Reth said. "Of." "I am aware of the mortality." Valsetha's crest did not move. "Advance the seat." There was a procedure and Reth followed it, because he was a physician of the Institute and the alternative to following it was to be removed from the gallery and replaced by someone who would. And then Reth would learn what happened next by report instead of by eye, and Reth had already decided, somewhere in the last 9 hours, that he needed to see this with his own eyes. He gave Osk the order. Osk gave it to the cradle. The cradle did the thing it did, and below the glass the young man's body seized against the restraints as the strain was driven harder into him, and Reth waited for the scream that always came, the scream that meant the gate was opening. The human did not scream. He made a sound. Reth would think about that sound for a long time afterward, would hear it in the quiet of his own quarters, would fail to describe it to himself in any vrac the word. He made a sound that was low and controlled, and came out through his teeth. Not a scream, but the flat, hard exhale of a body doing work. The sound a laborer makes lifting a stone that is very nearly too heavy and lifting it anyway. And then he breathed again, slow, down long and out longer, and his eyes came off the ceiling plate and found the glass of the observation gallery. And though there was no possible way for him to see through it, though it was mirrored on his side and he could not have known there was anyone behind it at all, Reth had the distinct and unscientific sensation of being looked at. The consonance meter, which had run out of dial, ticked once more against its housing and stopped ticking, because the needle had bent flat against the pin and could go no farther. "Physician," said Osk very quietly, so quietly that only Reth could hear it. "Physician, it isn't falling. We advanced the seat and it isn't falling. It went up." "I see it," Reth said. "That's not," Osk swallowed. "There's no curve for that." "No," Reth agreed, "there isn't." Valsetha had turned back to the glass. His hands were folded behind him in the posture of a senior cast at rest, and if he had felt anything at all watching a human refuse the gate that every other species in the catalog had passed through screaming, none of it reached the flat black of his eyes. But Reth had served under him for 19 years, and Reth noticed that the overseer's folded hands had tightened, one thumbclaw pressed white against the opposite wrist, and that Valsetha had not given a further order. He was waiting. He was watching the human breathe, and he was waiting to see the old certainty reassert itself, the way certainty always did. Any moment now the body would remember that it was outmatched. Any moment the argument would end. Below the glass, the human closed his eyes and breathed and held. His name, according to the manifest, was Cole Tennant, and Reth had not intended to learn it. Substrate did not have names in any sense the Institute cared about. But the tug's registry had come with the sale, a careless inclusion by a raider crew that catalogued its plunder more thoroughly than its captives, and somewhere in the registry was a crew roster, and somewhere on the roster was the human, listed by trade before he was listed by name. Hull diver, cold water rated, salvage certification, rescue endorsement. Not a soldier. That was the thing Reth kept returning to in the days that followed, the small stubborn fact that would not lie flat. They had brought the hardest substrate in the catalog to the cradle, and the substrate was not a warrior of his kind at all. He was a man who went into cold water after wrecks, a man whose trade was the patient hostile places other members of his species could not survive, the crushing deeps and the frozen dark, and whose skill was not killing but lasting, going into a place that wanted him dead and staying there long enough to bring something out and then coming back. The Vraktha had spent 4 generations engineering a soldier who could endure, and by pure accident of the labor markets, they had put on the cradle a member of a species that considered enduring a civilian occupation. Reth went down to the cradle level after the overseer dismissed the gallery. He told himself it was to check the seat. It was not entirely a lie. The seat wanted checking. The early advance had a mortality, and Reth wanted eyes on the subject before he trusted the remote column. But the seat could have been checked by Osk, and Reth went himself and stood at the foot of the cradle in the low blue working light of the shaping bay and looked at the human who had not broken. Up close the wrongness was worse. A subject 9 hours seated should have been a ruin. The strain tore a body apart to rebuild it, and the tearing showed, in every prior case, as a kind of dissolution, the subject slack and gray and emptied, the person draining out to make room for the soldier. The human was not emptied. He was exhausted, yes. Reth could read that much across the species gap in the gray tinge of the skin and the tremor that ran through the long muscles of the arms when the restraints let them shift. But behind the exhaustion the man was entirely, stubbornly present. His eyes tracked Reth as Reth moved around the cradle. They were aware. They were assessing. They were doing, Reth realized, exactly what Reth's own eyes were doing, taking the measure of a thing that might be a threat. "You're the doctor," the human said. Reth had not expected speech. The strain seated in a subject's throat as everywhere else. Even before the gate, subjects lost language early, the words going soft and then gone. The human's voice was rough and low and cracked at the edges from disuse or from the sound he had made on the cradle. But the words were words, in the trade tongue the raiders used, which the Institute had loaded into the human on intake, because substrate that could understand an instruction shaped more cleanly than substrate that could not. "I am a physician of this Institute," Reth said. Same thing. The human's mouth moved at one corner. It was not a smile. Reth had reviewed enough xenocultural material to know the shape of a human smile, and this was a near relation of one, drier, with nothing warm in it. You're the one who decides what happens to me. Yes. Okay, the human breath down long out longer. Then I'll talk to you, and not the old one. Reth should have corrected him. The overseer decided. A third-rank physician executed. But the correction did not come, and instead Reth found himself asking the question that had brought him down from the gallery, the question that had no place in a shaping bay because it had never once needed asking. You understand what is being done to you? Yeah, no hesitation. You're trying to turn me into one of your soldiers. The strain's supposed to take me apart and build back something that does what it's told. The human's eyes came off the ceiling plate and found Reth's direct level, without the flinch that lower castes gave a physician's gaze. The one who understands the trade talk told me, before. Thought it would scare me. Did it? No, the human considered. It's just work. Somebody wants to break me down and make me into a thing that's useful to them. That's not new. That's most jobs. The dry corner of the mouth again. Yours is louder about it. Reth stood at the foot of the cradle and did not know what to say, and the consonants meter on the wall of the bay. A repeater slave to the one that had bent flat against its pin in the gallery, ticked once, patiently, against its own housing, and did not fall. You should have broken, Reth said. It was not a physician's thing to say. It came out anyway. 4 hours ago, by every curve I have, you should already be gone. Yeah, well, the human closed his eyes. His breathing did not change. It went on, slow and deliberate and entirely under his own command. The breathing of a man who had learned in cold water a long way from any help that the body will drown you the moment you let it panic, and had learned to not let it. I get that a lot. Reth left the bay and did not check the seat, because he understood now that the seat was not the thing that would kill the human, and that nothing in the shaping bay was going to kill the human at all, and that this was the beginning of a problem that would reach a great deal higher than a third-rank physician standing in the blue working light listening to a man breathe. Behind him on the wall, the meter ticked. The report Reth filed that night was accurate, complete, and read by the wrong person 11 hours later. He had written it plainly as a physician writes. Subject fully seated at the 9th shaping strain, standard introduction, standard distribution, no procedural deviation. Then the deviations that were not procedural. Breaking gate not reached at expected cycle time. Breaking gate not reached at advanced seat. Consonants resonance climbing rather than falling, exceeding instrument range on 3 independent columns. Subject retains language. Subject retains volition. Subject retains. Reth had written, and then had sat looking at the unfinished line for a long moment before he finished itself. He had recommended, in the measured language of the Institute, that the cycle be held for observation, and the subject studied rather than concluded, on the grounds that a substrate which resisted the strain, this completely represented either a catastrophic contamination of the batch or a datum the Institute could not afford to destroy before it understood it. He had believed the recommendation was sound. He still believed it. It did not matter what he believed. The report went up the chain to the overseer, as all reports did, and the overseer read it, and the overseer did not hold the cycle for observation. The overseer forwarded the report, with a single appended line, to an office 3 jumps away in the direction of the front. An office Reth had heard named in the Institute the way physicians name a diagnosis they are afraid of. The marshal's office. Reth learned this the next morning when he arrived for the cradle round and found the gallery already occupied, and the occupant was not Valsetha. She stood at the glass with her hands loose at her sides, and where Valsetha had folded himself into the stillness of a cast at rest, this one held a stillness that was the opposite kind, the readiness of a thing that hunts. Her hide was banded, dark over a paler underlayer, the pattern of a warrior line rather than an administrator's, and across the left side of her face, ran the pale seam of an old wound that the Vraktha did not heal cosmetically, because a wound survived was a thing worth showing. She wore the gray of the marshal's office and the collar marks of a war adjutant, and when Reth entered the gallery she did not turn. "You are the physician who wrote the report," she said. "I am, adjutant." Kesavor, seventh of the marshal's hand. She watched the human on the cradle below. He was awake. He had been awake, the overnight column said, for the entire cycle, refusing the sedation the strain was supposed to make unnecessary, breathing his slow, deliberate breath, and the consonance meter had held all night against its bent pin, neither falling nor finding any further room to climb. "Your report says the substrate retains self. Explain the word." Reth chose his words with care, because a war adjutant 3 jumps from the front did not travel to a shaping station to hear a physician be imprecise. The 9th shaping functions by dissolution. The strain does not add a soldier to a subject. It removes the subject and installs a soldier in the space the subject occupied. The consonance meter measures the subject's resistance to that removal, the resonance of a self insisting on remaining itself. In every prior shaping the resonance spikes at the moment of breaking and then falls to nothing because the self loses. This subject's resonance has not fallen. By the only measure the Institute possesses, his self has not lost. It is, at present, winning. "Winning," Kesavor said the word without inflection, turning it over. "A civilian of a mongrel deathworld species, seated at full strain for a cycle and a half, is winning a fight my Institute has never lost in 4 generations." "Yes, adjutant." "And you recommended we observe him." "I recommended we not destroy the only subject that has ever done this before we understand how he does it." For the first time Kesavor turned from the glass and looked at Reth directly, and Reth felt the weight of the look the way prey feels the weight of a hunter's attention across open ground, the flat total assessment of a creature deciding whether a thing in front of it is worth the effort of killing. It lasted a long moment. Then something in the banded face shifted, not softening, only recalculating, and she turned back to the glass. "The marshal loses a column a week to the Sol," she said, "because the soldiers your Institute sends him cannot think. They hold formation into the grinder because holding formation is the only shape you gave them. They are perfect, and they are dying, and there are not enough of them, and the ones we have cost more to shape than they cost the enemy to kill." Her hand stayed loose at her sides. 4 generations ago a cadreborn could improvise. Somewhere in the refinements we shaped the improvisation out of them and called it discipline. I have read every report this Institute has filed for 11 years, physician. I know exactly how it is failing. I did not come here for another perfect corpse. She nodded once at the human below the glass. "I came to see if the deathworld could give me a soldier that lasts. And you are telling me it has given me one that will not be made into a soldier at all." "I am telling you what the instruments tell me, adjutant." "Then bring me a new instrument." She said it the way Valsetha had said recalibrate, but she meant something entirely different, and Reth understood the difference and went cold. "Not a meter, a test. Your consonance columns tell me he has a self. I do not care that he has a self. Selves are cheap, and I have a war to feed. I care whether the self is worth more to me on a battlefield than the soldier I meant to make out of him. So we will find out what the deathworld built, physician, before I let your overseer conclude it. Design me a trial. Something the strain was supposed to make a cadreborn survive that a civilian should not, and we will run the civilian through it and read the result." A pause. "All of it. Every metric you can hang an instrument on. If the deathworld is stronger raw than my cadre are shaped, I want the number, and I want it before I sign the order that shuts this place down." Behind Reth, unnoticed until he spoke, Valsetha had entered the gallery, and the overseer's voice came flat and careful into the space Kesavor's words had left. "Adjutant, with respect, the subject is a contaminated shaping. The correct disposition is to conclude the cycle, catalog the failure, and recradle the batch. To run a failed shaping through a cadre trial is to reward a defect with attention. Overseer, Kesavor did not raise her voice. She did not need to, the collar marks did the raising for her. Your institute has produced 11 years of correct dispositions, and my marshal has buried 11 years of correct corpses. I am done with correct. She looked at the human, who was looking impossibly back at the glass. Run the trials. I will read everyone. And if you are right, Overseer, and he is only a defect, then he will fail the first trial and die in it, and you will have your catalog entry, and I will have wasted a day. That is a cost I will pay. Design the trials, physician. Begin with cold. They began with cold, because cold was the trial the cadre survived best, and the trial that killed the unshaped most reliably, and because Kesavor wanted the first number to be one that would settle the matter fast in the Overseer's favor if the Overseer was right. Reth designed it. He was a physician, not a torturer, and he told himself the distinction still meant something as he laid out the parameters, and part of him, the part that had stood at the foot of the cradle and listened to a man call the unmaking of his self just work, knew that the distinction was already thinner than it had been a day ago and would be thinner still by the time this was done. The cold trial in cadre doctrine was a simple thing dressed in complicated instruments. A shaped soldier's body did not manage cold the way an unshaped body did. The strain rebuilt the way a cadre-born burned and stored and shed heat, so that a cadre column could hold a position on an ice front for days that would have killed the same species unshaped in an hour. It was one of the strain's proudest gifts, and the Institute measured it with a bank of instruments that read the body's argument with the cold. How hard it fought to hold its warmth, how long before the fight was lost. They put the human in the cold cell, and they watched the instruments. He did not last as long as a cadre-born. Reth had expected that. A cadre-born's cold tolerance was a manufactured thing, installed at cost, and no unshaped body had any business matching it. What Reth had not expected was the shape of the human's argument with the cold. A cadre-born held its warmth flat and level, burning at a rate the strain had fixed, holding the line until the fuel ran out and then failing all at once. The human did not hold a flat line. The human's argument climbed. His body met the cold and fought it and lost ground, and then Reth watched it happen on the instrument and did not believe it, found more ground to give, dropped its own warmth in the extremities and hoarded it at the core, shifted and adjusted and bargained with the cold in a dozen small ways that no cadre-born ever did because a cadre-born had been shaped past the need to bargain. The human was not stronger against the cold than a cadre-born. He was smarter against it. His body had spent an evolutionary history in cold water on an ordeal-tier world, learning 1,000 tricks for lasting that the Vraktha had engineered out of their soldiers in the name of purity. And it ran all of them in order, while the man breathed his slow breath and stared at the cell wall and did not make a sound. He came out of the cold cell gray and shaking and alive. At a duration a cadre-born would have doubled, and Kesavor read the number, and read the shape of the curve beside it, and Reth watched her read the shape and understood that she had seen the same thing he had. He lost, Valsetha said. The cadre number is higher, log the failure. The cadre number is higher, Kesavor agreed. Look at the curve, Overseer. The cadre-born holds a line and then dies. The civilian never holds a line at all. He gives ground the whole way down and never once runs out of ground to give. Extend the trial. She turned to Reth. How far can the instrument follow him? Further than this, adjutant, but the mortality. How far? Reth told her. She nodded, and the second cold trial ran longer than the first, and the human's body found new tricks Reth had not known a body possessed, and when they pulled him out, he was closer to death than any subject Reth had ever brought back from a trial, and he was, still, himself. He looked at Reth through the frost on his own eyelashes, and his cracked mouth moved, and what came out barely was, that all. It was not defiance. Reth had reviewed enough material to know defiance. Defiance was loud and it performed for an audience. This was quieter than that and worse. The human had asked the question the way a laborer asks whether the shift is over, not challenging the work, only wanting to know how much of it was left. He had endured the cold to the edge of dying, and his only question was whether there was more. And the flatness of it, the sheer procedural calm of a man treating his own near death as a task with a duration, put a silence in the gallery that Reth felt in his back teeth. "There is more," Kesavor told the human through the cell speaker, and Reth heard something in her voice he had not heard before, something that was not cruelty and was not mercy and had a great deal in it of a hunter recognizing, across the open ground, another hunter. "Rest. We will continue." "You want to know," the human said. His eyes had closed. His breath went down long and out longer. "Whether I'm worth keeping." A pause, and Reth thought he had lost consciousness, but then, "Ask the water. I outlasted the water. Water's patient. You people are in a hurry." He said nothing else. Reth had the medical team stabilize him, over Valsetha's objection that stabilizing a failed shaping was a waste of the Institute's stores, and Kesavor overruled the overseer without appearing to notice she was doing it, and Reth stood in the recovery bay in the small hours and watched the human breathe and thought about the water. He had spent his life, Reth realized, doing to subjects a faster, louder version of what the cold water had done to the human for a career, applying a hostile environment to a body and reading how the body failed. The difference was that Reth applied the environment in order to break the body and rebuild it, and the water had applied it and left the body to rebuild itself. And the body the water had built was standing up out of every trial the Institute could design, while the bodies the Institute built stood in perfect formation on the ice front and died. By the fourth day, the trials had a rhythm, and the rhythm had a name in the working spaces of the Institute that no one said in the gallery. They called it quietly the argument, because the human argued. Not with words. He had stopped talking to anyone but Reth, and to Reth only in the flat, exhausted fragments a man has left at the bottom of a trial, but with his body, which met every environment the Institute could build and argued with it, gave ground and took ground and never conceded the field. Cold, they had run. Then load, the endurance of a body under sustained strain, another cadre proud point, another instrument bank, another curve. The cadreborn held a fixed output until the fixed output failed. The human's output was lower and it never failed. It fell and recovered and fell and recovered, and Reth watched a body under a killing load teach itself, over the course of a single trial, to carry the load in ways it had not known how to carry it when the trial began. That was the datum that finally made Osk sit down at his column and put his hands over his face. "Physician," the junior said, muffled. "It's learning, inside the trial. The cadreborn comes off the cradle finished, everything it can do at the start, and it never changes. This one changes. Every trial he's worse at the start than a cadreborn and better at the end because he's still." Osk lowered his hands. His crest, undisciplined, young, had gone flat and would not come up. "Physician, we spent 4 generations shaping the ability to change out of the cadre, because a soldier that changes is a soldier that might change into something we didn't order. And the Sul are killing our finished soldiers because they can't change. And this thing on the cradle can't stop changing, and we didn't do it, and we don't know how to make it stop, and the adjutant is writing all of it down." Reth put a hand on the junior's shoulder, which was not a thing physicians of the Institute did, and left it there for a moment, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was both true and bearable. On the trial floor, the human finished the load trial at a number that was still below the cadre benchmark in climbing, and asked Reth, through the speaker, in his flat, cracked voice, whether that was all. The overseer denied the body, went after the mind. He proposed it as a trial, and Reth could not refuse it, because it was a real cadre measure, and the adjutant had ordered every measure the instruments could take. The Institute called it the holding trial, and it was the one the shaping order was proudest of after the cold, because a made soldier's obedience was not only in the marrow, It was in the mind, and the strain built a quadriborn that could be left in the dark and the silence, cut off from every instruction and every sense, and would not come apart the way an unshaped mind came apart when you took the world away from it. The Institute measured it in the holding cell. No light, no sound, no touch, no time. A mind left alone with itself for as long as the instruments could bear to run, reading how long before the self, given nothing to hold to, let go. An unshaped mind, the doctrine held, could not survive the holding. It needed the world too much. Take the world away, and the unshaped mind filled the dark with its own terrors and drowned in them. And this, the Institute taught, was why a soldier had to be made. Because a raw person was a thing that needed the world, and a made soldier needed nothing but the order, and a thing that needs nothing cannot be broken by having everything taken away. They put the human in the holding cell and took the world away from him, and Reth watched the instruments, and the instruments read a thing the doctrine had no shape for. The human did not fill the dark with terrors, he filled it with work. Reth could not see what the man did in the lightless silence. There was nothing to see, but the instruments read the shape of a mind that had gone somewhere and set itself a task, the same slow, deliberate rhythm the body used against the cold, turned inward now against the nothing. Later, in the recovery bay, Reth asked him, and the answer was the flattest and most ordinary thing the man ever said, and it undid the holding trial more completely than any number. "You run the dive," Cole said. "In your head, the whole thing start to finish. Every wreck I ever went into, where the lines were, where the cold came in, what I do different. When you're down there in the dark and your air's short, you don't fight the dark, doctor. The dark always wins a fight. You give it something to do. You give yourself a job small enough to hold, and then you hold it, and the dark's just the room you're doing it in." He had held a job in the dark for longer than the holding cell had ever run on a made soldier and come out the far side of it himself, and asked, through the speaker, in the flat cracked voice, whether that was all. Osk logged the number and did not speak for a long time, and when he did, his young, undisciplined crest had gone flat and stayed flat. "Physician," he said, "we built the whole doctrine on the idea that a raw mind can't be left alone with itself. That's why we make them, so they won't need the world." He looked at the column. "He doesn't need the world either. He just brought his own, and we can't take that away because it isn't the world, it's him. It's the part we've been cutting out for 4 generations, and calling it the making." Kesavor came to Reth's working quarters on the 5th night, which meant something, because war adjutants did not come to third-rank physicians. She came alone, and she did not sit, and she stood in the middle of the small room with her hands loose and her banded face unreadable, and said, without preamble, "The overseer has filed a disposition. He wants the subject concluded. He argues the trials are corrupting the Institute's discipline, that the junior staff are demoralized, that the longer the anomaly persists the more it looks like the doctrine has a flaw. He is not wrong about any of it." She watched Reth. "You will have a counterfiling. You always do. Make it now to me in words, and I will decide whether it is worth reading in ink." Reth had been composing the counterfiling in his head for 3 days and had not written a line of it, because every version he composed ended in a place he did not want to put in ink. He said it to her instead. "The overseer is correct that the anomaly reveals a flaw in the doctrine," Reth said. "He is wrong about which flaw. He believes the flaw is in this batch of strain, or in this substrate, or in the trial design, something local, something correctable. It is not local. The subject reveals a flaw in the premise. The Institute's entire doctrine rests on one belief, that a soldier must be made. That the raw material of a person is inadequate to war, and that the strain's work, the breaking and the rebuilding, is what turns inadequate material into a soldier. 4 generations of refinement have all been refinements of the making." Reth met the war adjutant's flat eyes and did not look away, which cost him something. "The subject on the cradle has not been made. The strain seated in him and did nothing. Every gift the Institute installs at ruinous cost, the cold holding, the load-bearing, the endurance, he possesses already, unmade, raw as a civilian of a hard world, worse than possesses. He improves them under trial in real time, which no made soldier can do because the making forecloses it. Adjutant, I do not have a counterfiling that saves the Institute. I have a finding that ends it. The finding is that the best soldier the Institute has ever measured is the one it did not touch. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the station's bones a pump cycled and fell silent. Say the rest of it, Kesavor said. You have not said the rest of it. I can see it behind your teeth. Reth said the rest of it. If the finding is true, he said, then the Marshal does not need the Institute. He needs to stop trying to make soldiers and start recruiting them, from worlds like this one. Whole, unmade, keeping their selves. And the reason my overseer wants the subject concluded tonight, Adjutant, is not discipline. It is that a live human standing up out of every trial we can build is a document, and the document proves that everything this Institute has done for 4 generations was not the making of soldiers. It was the breaking of better ones. Kesavor did not answer for a long time. When she did not answer the thing he had said. She answered a thing underneath it. You have grown fond of the substrate. I have grown accurate about him, Adjutant. It is a different thing. It is not, in a physician, a safe thing. She moved to the small window of Reth's quarters, where the station's curve fell away toward the pale disk of the Vrak, the homeworld below, half-lit, the dayline crawling across the northern seas. I will not sign the overseer's disposition tonight. I will not sign yours either because you have not written one, and because the one you would write ends my war. Do you understand what you are asking me to carry back to the Marshal? That we cannot make soldiers, that we must go and find them, on worlds that will not thank us for the visit, and ask them to fight for us as themselves, and trust selves we did not install. The Marshal has spent his whole life on the certainty that a soldier is a made thing. You want me to hand him a corpse of that certainty, and ask him to thank me. I want you to read the number, Adjutant. You asked for the number. I did not know when you asked what the number would say. No, she watched the dayline crawl. Neither did I. A pause. Run the rest of the trials, all of them. I will not conclude him, and I will not release him, and I will not decide, because a decision made on 5 days of data is a decision the Marshal will overturn on the 6th. Give me every number the instruments can take. And physician, she turned from the window, and the old seam on her face caught the working light. The overseer will not wait for my decision. A caste that old, that close to losing everything he built, does not wait. Watch him. He will try to conclude the subject before the data can indict him. Do not let him. Not yet. Not until I have read all of it. She left. Reth stood at the window a while longer, and below him the day line crossed the northern seas of a world that had made soldiers out of its children for 4 generations, and he thought about the water, and about a young man in the cold, and about how long a thing could last if you never let it panic. The overseer moved on the 7th day, as Kesavor had said he would, and he did not move clumsily. He did not order the subject concluded. That order would have been logged, and a logged order against the adjutant's standing instruction was a wound the overseer could not survive. He moved sideways. He filed a contamination alert against the batch of strain seated in the human, which by Institute protocol required the immediate biological isolation of any subject carrying the batch. And biological isolation meant the isolation cell, and the isolation cell was outside the adjutant's trial protocol, and inside the overseer's medical authority. And once the human was inside it, Valsetha could do a great many things to him under the color of containment that he could not do under the color of a trial. Reth caught it because he read the filings, all of them, the way Kesavor read the reports, and he caught it 4 hours before the isolation order took effect, and he did the only thing a third-rank physician could do against an overseer's medical authority. He got there first. He went down to the shaping bay where they were holding the human between trials, and he sent the attending junior away on an errand that did not need running, and he stood at the foot of the cradle where he had first spoken to the man, and he said, "They are going to move you. In 4 hours. To a cell I cannot follow you into. The overseer will call it containment. It is not containment." The human was sitting up. They had let him sit up between trials because the restraints did nothing that mattered against a body they could not break. The cradle held him because he permitted it to, and everyone in the bay had come quietly to understand that. He looked at Reth with the flat assessing calm that Reth had stopped finding unsettling and started, against every instinct of his caste, to trust. What happens in the cell? He will drive the strain harder, past any dose a trial permits. He will try to force the breaking the trials have failed to produce, because a broken subject is a concluded subject, and a concluded subject is a catalog entry, and a catalog entry cannot testify that the doctrine is wrong. Reth found that his hands had folded behind him in the posture of a caste at rest, and made them stop. He will hurt you in ways I have spent 19 years learning to measure. And he will do it where I cannot read the instruments, which means where I cannot stop him at the mortality. Why are you telling me this? Not suspicion, genuine inquiry in the flat, cracked voice. You work for him. I work for the Institute. Same thing. No, Reth said, and heard how much he needed it to be true. Not the same thing. The Institute is supposed to be the study of soldiers. He has made it the manufacture of them. There is a version of this institute that would look at you and want to understand you. He looks at you and wants to erase you before you finish being an answer he cannot afford. Reth stopped, started again lower. I want to understand you. That is the whole of it. I have spent my life breaking bodies to make them into soldiers, and you have shown me in 7 days that the bodies were better before I touched them. And I would like to know how, before he takes you somewhere I cannot follow, and makes you into a number instead of a finding. The human was quiet. His breath went down long and out longer, and then he said a thing Reth had not expected and would carry a long time. On my world there's cold water under ice, the human said. You go under to cut a line free, fix a hull, pull somebody out, and the whole time you're down there the water is telling you to panic. Every part of you. The cold's telling you, the dark's telling you, the air you don't have is telling you. Panic's the fast way out. Panic and you thrash and you burn what you've got and it's over quick and it doesn't hurt as long. He looked at Reth. The job is you don't. You do the work with all of that screaming at you and you don't let it move you any faster than the work needs. That's the whole trade. It's not strength. Strong guys drown. It's you decide before you go under that the water doesn't get to decide when you're done. You do. A pause. Your strain's just cold water, loud water. Been telling me to panic for 7 days. Same answer as always, the dry corner of the mouth. I'll go in his cell, tell him to bring whatever he's got. Water's patient, he's not. And you'll be reading the number when it's over, because he's going to write it down whether he means to or not, and it's going to say the same thing every number said. He lay back on the cradle and closed his eyes, and Reth understood that the man had just told him how to win. It's going to say I lasted. Reth did not let the overseer take him to the cell. He could not stop the isolation order. A third rank had no standing against an overseer's medical authority, but he could invoke a protocol above them both, and he did. And it was the most dangerous thing he had ever done in 19 years of careful survival inside the Institute. He filed over his own name, a finding of scientific priority, a formal declaration that the subject constituted a datum of such significance to the marshal's active inquiry that no disposition, medical, containment, or otherwise, could be executed without the adjutant's direct order. It was a real protocol. It was almost never used, because using it meant a third-rank physician standing between an overseer and his authority, and betting his career that the marshal's office would land on the physician's side. He filed it, and he sent it to Kesavor, and then he waited in the shaping bay beside the human in the 4 hours before the isolation order, and did not know whether he had saved the man or ended himself or both. Cassavor's answer came 90 minutes later. It came not as a message but as her presence, in the doorway of the shaping bay, in the gray of the marshal's office, with Valsetha behind her wearing the flat stillness of a caste that has just been overruled and has not yet decided what it will do about it. Priority sustained, Cassavor said. The subject is the marshal's inquiry. He goes to no cell that is not a trial cell. Overseer, your contamination alert is noted and denied. The batch is not contaminated. The substrate is anomalous, and I will not permit the anomaly to be disposed of under the color of hygiene. She looked at Reth. Her banded face gave nothing away, but she held the look a beat longer than the words required, and Reth understood that he had bet his career, and that the bet for now had come in. Physician. You will run the remaining trials under my direct authority, all of them, and you will run one I have added. She stepped aside, and behind her in the corridor, Reth saw what she had brought with her from the deck below. It stood in the gray half-light of the corridor, and it was a cadreborn. Reth had seen finished cadre before. He had made them, but he had never stood one beside a subject mid-trial, and Cassavor had brought this one up from the garrison deck precisely so that the two of them could be seen in the same frame, because the war adjutant understood, as the overseer did not, that a number on a column persuaded a marshal less than a thing he could look at with his own eyes. The cadreborn was Vraxa. It had been before its shaping a person. Reth did not know its name, and it did not have one now, only a garrison designation and a rank. It was larger than the human by half again, banded dark, its hide thickened at the shoulders and forearms where the strain had built it for war, and it stood in the corridor in a stillness that was nothing like the human's and nothing like Valsetha's. It was the stillness of a thing waiting for an instruction. There was no assessment in it. There was no self behind the eyes measuring the room, weighing the exits, taking the temperature of the people in it. There was only the readiness to be told what to do, and under the readiness, in the flat, unmoving eyes, there was nothing at all. Reth had made 100 of these and had never once, until he stood one beside a man who had kept himself, understood that the eyes were empty. This is a cadreborn of the current generation, Cassavor said, for the record, for the columns, for the marshal who would read this. Shaped in this institute 9 months ago. It is, by every metric the institute possesses, a successful shaping. It holds cold longer than the subject. It bears load higher than the subject. It is stronger, it is faster, it is more durable, and it will walk into fire on my word and not slow. She turned to the human, who had risen from the cradle and stood now on his own feet, gray and worn and entirely present, looking at the cadreborn with the flat professional interest of a man sizing up a piece of equipment. It has been failing on the ice front for a year, physician, because the moment the Sul do a thing it was not shaped to expect, it stands in its perfect formation and dies. I have watched it happen from a command deck. Perfect soldiers, holding a line into a grinder, because holding the line is the only thing left in them after we finished making them. She looked back at Reth. I have a made soldier that cannot think and a raw one that cannot stop thinking. I am going to put them in the same trial. And I am going to read which one is worth my war. What trial, adjutant? Reth said, though he thought he already knew and dreaded it. The one the Institute never runs, Cassavor said, because the cadre always fail it and the Institute stopped logging the failures. The improvisation trial. The one where we change the rules in the middle and do not tell them. Her old seam caught the light. Design it, physician, and let us find out what the deathworld packed into a man that 4 generations of my finest work could not. Reth designed the improvisation trial the way he had designed the others, with instruments and parameters and a mortality he wrote down and did not like, and he designed it to be fair, which was a thing the Institute's trials had never needed to be because the Institute's trials had never had 2 subjects. The trial floor was a wide low chamber below the garrison deck, walled in the gray composite the Vraxa built everything from, lit by the flat blue working light that the human had told Reth. once between trials, made his eyes ache in a way the cold water never had. In the standard cadre exercise, a subject was given a task with a clear shape: reach a mark, hold a position, carry a load a distance, and the instruments read how efficiently the shaped body executed the known task. Reth kept the opening of the trial standard, so that the cadreborn would begin on ground it understood, and then he built into the trial a series of changes that would arrive without warning. The mark would move, the ground would shift, the task would become a different task while the subject was still executing the first one. Nothing lethal in the changes themselves. The lethality, if it came, would come from the subject's response to them. He explained none of it to either subject. That was the trial. They began, and for the first minutes the cadreborn was magnificent, and Reth made himself watch it and not look away, because it was his own work and he had never before been made to see it clearly. The task was to cross the floor to a marked position and hold it, and the cadreborn crossed the floor like a thing poured out of a mold for exactly this, economical and total, no motion wasted, and reached the mark and held it in a stillness so complete that the instruments read almost nothing from it, a body at perfect readiness spending nothing, waiting to be told the next thing. Beside it the human crossed the floor worse, slower, his worn body still gray from the cold trials, reading the room as he went in a way the instruments caught as a scatter of small inefficiencies, glances, adjustments, a man walking into a place he did not trust and cataloging it. He reached the mark second. On the standard metric he had already lost. Then Reth moved the mark. He moved it without warning, a section of the floor lighting to indicate a new position across the chamber, the old mark going dark, and he watched the two subjects meet the change. And the watching was the moment Reth stopped being able to pretend he did not already know how this ended. The cadreborn did not move. It had been given a task: reach the mark, hold it, and it had reached the mark and it was holding it, and the mark it was holding had gone dark, and there was no instruction in it for what a cadreborn did when the thing it was holding stopped being the thing. So it held the dark mark. It held the place where the task had been, in perfect readiness, spending nothing, waiting for an instruction that the trial was never going to give. And the instruments read its beautiful, terrible stillness, and Reth thought of the ice front and of columns holding formation into the grinder, and understood, at last and completely, what Kesavor had been trying to make him see. The human was already moving. He had seen the new mark light and the old one go dark, and he had crossed to the new one before Reth had finished registering that the cadreborn would not, and he reached it and stood on it, and then, this was the thing. This was the datum that made Osk make a sound at his column. This was what 4 generations of shaping had cost. The human turned and looked back at the cadreborn standing on the dark mark, and something moved across his worn face that Reth had learned to read, and it was not triumph. It was recognition. The human looked at the perfect soldier holding the place where the task used to be, and he understood, faster than the instruments could, what he was looking at, and the flat, cracked voice came across the trial floor, quiet not for the gallery, for the cadreborn. "Hey," the human said. "It moved, come on, it moved, over here." The cadreborn did not answer, because there was no one in it to answer, and the human looked at it a moment longer with an expression Reth would spend a long time failing to name, and then turned back to the trial, because the trial was still running and the water was still patient, and there was work to do. Reth changed the task 3 more times. Each time the human met the change, and the cadreborn did not, and each time the gap between them widened, not because the human was stronger. He never once outmeasured the cadreborn on any raw metric, was slower and weaker and more worn on every column that read the body alone, but because the human kept arriving at the new task, while the cadreborn stood in perfect readiness at the grave of the old one. And each time, before the human turned to the new work, he looked back at the empty soldier holding the empty mark, and each time the look was the same, and the third time Reth finally named it, and having named it could not unname it. It was grief. The human, worn to the edge of collapse, winning a trial designed to kill him, kept stopping to grieve the thing standing beside him that had been a person once and had been made into a soldier and could no longer even find the mark. "Conclude the trial," Valsetha said. His voice was very flat. "The metrics are logged. The Cadreborn's raw superiority is established across every column. The subject's improvisation is a known deathworld trait and requires no further." Overseer. Kesavor did not look at him. She was watching the human who had stopped moving because Reth had stopped changing the task, and who stood now in the blue light breathing his slow breath, and who had not once in the whole trial spent emotion on anything but the work and the grief. "Do you know why the cadre fail on the ice front? The Sul employ irregular. The cadre fail on the ice front," Kesavor said, "because when the plan dies, there is no one left inside them to make a new one. We shaped the person out and kept the soldier, and it turns out the person was the part that could win. I have just watched a worn civilian outfight my finest shaping by doing the one thing my finest shaping cannot do, which is notice that the world has changed and change with it." She turned from the glass, and for the first time since she had arrived at Halleck Vor, something showed in the banded face, and it was not the hunter's calm and it was not the adjutant's authority. It was something closer to the look the human had worn, looking at the Cadreborn. "And I have watched him stop, 3 times in a trial that is killing him, to try to call the empty one to safety. Overseer, I did not come here for a soldier that is stronger. I have a warehouse of soldiers that are stronger, and they are dying in perfect formation, and it is bankrupting my marshal to bury them. I came here for a soldier that is still a person. And you have had one seated on your cradle for 11 days, and your instinct, your first and last and only instinct, has been to conclude him before anyone could read what he is." She let the silence do its work. "Log the trial, under my authority, and bring me the biological finding, physician, the one I asked for on the first day. I want to know what the strain has done to him." That was the finding Reth had been afraid to complete, and he completed it that night in the low blue light of his working quarters, alone, with the columns and the 11 days of data spread in the air around him. And what the finding said was worse for the Institute than anything the trials had shown. The strain had done nothing to him. Not nothing in the sense of failing to break him. Reth had known that since the first day, since the consonance meter had bent against its pin. Nothing in a deeper and more ruinous sense. Reth traced the strain through 11 days of the human's body and found it walled off, quarantined. The human's body had met the engineered agent that had unmade every other species in the catalog, and it had not fought the strain to a standstill the way Reth had first assumed. A standstill was a war still being waged, a thing that could still tip. It had done something stranger and more final. It had studied the strain the way it studied a cold cell or a killing load, patiently, giving ground and taking it, and it had learned the strain, and then it had folded the strain into itself and set it aside, disarmed, catalogued, a thing that had tried to be a threat and had been reduced to a specimen. The strain was still in him. It would be in him for the rest of his life. And it was doing nothing, because his body had done to the strain exactly what the human had described doing to the cold water, refused to let it decide when he was done, and then, patiently, outlasted it. Which meant the improvement was not the strain's. That was the line Reth sat with for a long time before he let himself write it, because writing it ended the Institute in ink. Every gain the trials had measured, the endurance that climbed instead of holding, the body that learned inside a trial, the improvisation that outfought a Cadreborn, none of it was the 9th shaping's work. The strain had been neutralized on the first day. Everything the human had done since, he had done as himself, unmade, unimproved, a worn civilian of a hard world running the same trade he had run in cold water under ice, which was the trade of lasting. The Institute had spent 4 generations and a war's worth of treasure engineering the ability to endure, and had installed it, at ruinous cost, in soldiers who could not think. and a member of a species that considered endurance a civilian occupation had walked in off a salvage tug already possessing all of it, plus the self the Institute had learned to break. And the self, it turned out, was the part that won. Reth wrote the finding. He wrote it plainly as a physician writes. Strain neutralized, cycle 1. All subsequent performance attributable to unshaped baseline. Recommend, he wrote, and stopped, because the recommendation that followed from the finding was not a medical recommendation. It was the end of everything he had built his life inside. He wrote it anyway. Recommend the Institute's mandate be reconsidered from its foundation. The subject demonstrates that the strongest soldier available to the Marshal is the one the Institute does not touch. Then he sat in the blue light with the finding hanging in the air, and he thought about what the Overseer would do when he read it, because the Overseer would read it. Every finding went up the chain, and the Overseer had spent 7 days trying to conclude the human under the color of hygiene, and that had been before the finding said his life's work was not the making of soldiers but the breaking of better ones. A caste that old, that close to losing everything, did not wait. Kesavor had told Reth that on the 5th night, and she had been right about it once, and Reth did not think she would need to be right about it twice. He was reaching to root the finding to Kesavor's eyes only, to keep it out of the Overseer's chain until the adjutant could act on it, when the station's working lights dropped to the amber of a containment event, and the pumps he had heard cycle in the station's bones all week went silent all at once, and a klaxon Reth had never heard in 19 years. The deep, slow tone the Institute reserved for a breach of the garrison deck began to sound. The garrison deck, where they had brought the Cadreborn up from. Reth was already moving toward the door when his column chimed with a priority override, and the voice that came through it was Valsetha's, flat and old and entirely calm, and what the Overseer said turned the amber light to ice in Reth's chest. Physician. There has been an incident with the garrison stock. The subject is loose on the trial deck. I am invoking full containment authority under threat to the station. A pause, and in the pause Reth heard the whole shape of it, the trap the old caste had built the moment his hygiene alert had failed. Report to the trial deck. We are going to conclude the anomaly after all, and this time, physician, it will be in the record as self-defense. Reth reached the trial deck ahead of the containment teams, because the containment teams were forming up at the garrison deck 2 levels below, where the breach had been reported, and Reth understood before he arrived that the breach had not happened where it was reported. It had happened here. The old caste had been precise. He had opened the trial deck to the garrison stock and logged the opening 2 levels down, so that the record would show a containment failure spreading upward, and the physician arriving into an active threat. And whatever the physician found on the trial deck would be read, later, in the amber light of an emergency, as a thing that had been necessary. What Reth found on the trial deck was quiet. The blue working light had dropped to amber. The wide, low chamber where he had run the improvisation trial that afternoon stood empty of staff. The junior monitors were gone, pulled back behind the containment line, and the observation gallery above was dark. And on the floor of the chamber in the amber light stood the human and the Cadreborn, and they were not fighting. The Cadreborn had been given no instruction, and a Cadreborn with no instruction and no one to give it one was not a soldier at all, but a loaded thing waiting for a hand on it. Someone had opened its holding and pointed it at the trial deck and left, and it had come out onto the deck, the way water comes through an open valve, without intent, without malice, without anything but the terrible readiness the shaping had left in it, and it had found the one moving thing in the amber-lit chamber and fixed on it, and the one moving thing was the human. It stood across the floor from him in the poured-out stillness Reth had watched all afternoon, and every line of it was cocked toward violence, and it was waiting for a command, for a trigger, for the thing that would tell it to close the distance and do what it had been built to do. The human was not giving it one. He stood very still, Not the cadreborn's readiness stillness and not the cast's rest stillness. A third kind, the stillness Reth had seen in the cold cell and the killing load. The stillness of a body that has decided not to let the situation move it any faster than the work requires. His hands were open and low and away from his sides. His breath went down long and out longer. And he was talking in the flat, cracked voice, low and even, to a thing that had no one inside it to hear. "Easy," the human said, "easy. Nobody told you anything, huh? Somebody opened the door and left you here. That's not on you." He shifted his weight slow, a hand's width, watching the cadreborn's fixed, empty eyes track the motion. "I know what you are. I met you today. You held the mark after it went dark because holding the mark's the only thing they left you." Another slow hand's width. "I'm not going to give you a reason. You hear me? I'm not going to move fast and I'm not going to make a threat and there's not going to be a trigger, because the only thing in you is the trigger, and if I don't pull it, there's nothing else in there to make you come." His voice did not rise. It stayed exactly level, the voice of a man in cold water talking himself and everything around him out of the panic that was the fast way to die. "So we're just going to stand here, both of us, long as it takes." Reth stopped at the edge of the trial deck, inside the amber light, and did not move, because he understood that he had walked into the exact moment the Overseer had built, and that the moment was not going the way the Overseer had built it to go. Valsetha's plan had 2 exits and both were catalog entries. In the first, the cadreborn killed the human, and the record showed a containment failure and a substrate destroyed by garrison stock, tragic, unavoidable, concluded. In the second, the human killed the cadreborn, which the old cast plainly believed the deathworld animal would do, because that was what a deathworld animal did when a stronger thing came at it in the dark, and the record showed a substrate that had proven itself an uncontainable threat, a killer, a thing that had torn apart a Vrak the soldier with its hands, and self-defense authority closed over the anomaly and concluded it with the Institute's conscience clean. Either exit ended with the human dead and the finding buried. The old cast had not been able to conclude the man with hygiene, so he had built a room where the man's own nature would conclude him, and he had been certain of the man's nature the way the whole Institute had been certain of everything, right up until the consonance meter bent against its pin. The human was refusing both exits. He was standing in the amber light between a mindless soldier and his own death, and he was talking the situation down, patiently, hand's width by hand's width, because the third thing a deathworld animal could do, the thing not in the Overseer's model, the thing not in anyone's model, was decline to become the monster the room had been built to prove he was. "Physician," Valsetha's voice from the dark gallery above, calm, old, certain. "You are inside the containment perimeter. Withdraw. The garrison stock is uncontrolled and the substrate is engaged. Withdraw and let containment resolve." "Containment is not resolving anything, Overseer." Reth heard his own voice come out steadier than he felt. "The substrate is de-escalating the garrison stock. He is talking it down. He is a deathworld predator cornered by a stronger one. He will do what such things do." "He is doing it right now," Reth said. "Look." Because the human had closed half the distance. Slowly, hand's width by hand's width, talking the whole way, and the cadreborn had not triggered, because the human had given it nothing to trigger on, no sudden motion, no raised hand, no sound sharp enough to read as threat. And now the human stood an arm's length from a thing built to kill him. And he did the thing that Reth would carry out of the Institute and into whatever came after. The thing that ended Valsetha's plan and the doctrine, and the whole 4 generations of certainty, in a single quiet motion. He reached out, slow, open-handed, and he put his hand flat against the side of the cadreborn's thickened neck. The way a man calms an animal, the way a diver signals a panicking partner under ice that the air is coming, that the line is clear, that they are not going to die here today. And he held it there. And he said low level for the empty soldier and for no one else, "There's nobody coming to tell you what to do. So I'm telling you, stand down. You're done for the day. "Stand down." The Cadreborn stood down. It should not have. There was no command channel in the words. The human was not garrison, not caste, had no authority the shaping recognized. But the shaping had left the Cadreborn a thing that ran on instruction and starved without it, and it had stood on the amber deck for long minutes with no instruction and a hollow where a self should be, and a voice had finally come, steady and certain and unafraid, and told it what to do, and the empty thing took the instruction the way parched ground takes water, because taking instruction was the only thing left in it that still worked. Its cocked lines went slack, its fixed empty eyes unfixed. It stood in the amber light under the human's flat open hand, a made soldier at rest, harming no one, because the raw one had walked up to it unarmed and given it the one thing the Institute had shaped it to need. The trial deck was very quiet. In the dark gallery above, the overseer said nothing at all. Kesavor came onto the deck herself, past the containment line, which a war adjutant was not supposed to do into an active event, and she crossed the amber-lit floor to where the human stood with his hand still resting on the neck of the pacified Cadreborn, and she stopped an arm's length away and looked at the two of them, the maid and the raw, the empty and the whole, standing quiet together in the light of an emergency that had failed to become a killing. "You could have killed it," she said to the human, not an accusation, a physician's question almost, a taking of data. "It was built to kill you and someone let it out to do exactly that. No one on this station would have logged a word against you. You could have torn it apart and walked out clean and I would have signed the finding myself. Why didn't you?" The human took his hand off the Cadreborn's neck, slow, and the empty soldier stayed standing down, and he looked at the war adjutant with the flat, worn calm of a man. 11 days, past the last time anyone had let him sleep without instruments reading him. "Because it's not the one that opened the door," the human said. "It didn't do anything to me. Somebody used it, same as they've been using it its whole life, same as they're trying to use me." He breathed down long out longer. "Where I'm from, you don't get to hurt the thing somebody else is pointing at you and call it even. The one you go after is the one holding the leash." His eyes went once up to the dark gallery where the overseer stood unseen and came back to Kesavor. "I know who opened the door. You do too." "I do," Kesavor said. "I'm not going to do anything about it." The human said it flatly, and Reth understood that this was the thing the whole 11 days had been building toward, the thing the overseer had never once been able to model because it was not in the vrak the grammar of soldiers at all. "That's your job, not mine. I'm not your weapon. I didn't come here to be a soldier, and I'm not going to be one now just because your soldier's broken and you finally noticed. I'm a guy who goes in cold water after wrecks. That's all I've ever been. You people keep building rooms to find out what I really am underneath, and the answer keeps being this: a guy who does the work and doesn't panic and doesn't hurt the thing that isn't the problem. The dry corner of the mouth, almost too tired to make the shape. You want a better soldier than the ones you're growing. I get it. But you're not going to make one out of me because the second you make me into a soldier I stop being the thing you actually want, which is somebody who's still in there deciding for himself. You can't grow that. You can only wreck it. You've been wrecking it for 4 generations. He looked at the Cadreborn standing quiet and empty beside him. "Ask him." Kesavor was silent for a long moment. The old seam on her face caught the amber light. And then she did a thing Reth had never seen a war adjutant of the marshal's hand do, a thing that had no precedent in 19 years of the Institute, a thing that changed the temperature of the room and the shape of everything that would come after. She inclined her head, not the small acknowledgement a superior gives a subordinate. The deeper motion, the one the Vraktha reserved for an equal met across open ground, one hunter to another, one soldier to a soldier, the recognition a warrior line gave to a thing it had measured and found real. "Then I will do my job," she said, "and you will not have to do it for me." She straightened. Her voice came back level, the adjutant's voice, but under it something had shifted and would not shift back. "Physician. Get the garrison stock back to its holding. Gently, it is standing down and I will not have it triggered by a rough hand. Get the subject to recovery, and route me your finding, the biological one, the one you completed tonight and were about to hide from the overseer's chain. I read the station traffic, physician. I know you completed it. Route it to me now. She turned toward the dark gallery and raised her voice and let it carry up into the black where Valsetha stood. And you, overseer. You will remain on the station and touch nothing. Not the subject, not the stock, not a single instrument. You opened a door tonight to conclude a datum you could not answer, and you got a room full of witnesses instead, and one of them is a war adjutant of the marshal's hand. I have not decided yet what I am carrying back to the marshal, but I have decided that you will not be the one who decides it for me. A pause, and the last of it went up into the dark flat and cold. Do not make me have this conversation twice. There was no answer from the gallery, but somewhere above them in the black, Reth heard the old cast move once and go still, and the going still was the most frightening sound on the whole deck, because Reth had served under Valsetha for 19 years, and he knew exactly what it meant when the overseer stopped arguing. It meant the overseer had stopped trying to win the argument, and had started in the cold, patient dark to plan how to end it. Kesavor read the biological finding in Reth's working quarters, standing, the way she did everything, and when she reached the line Reth had been afraid to write, she read it twice, and then she was quiet for long enough that the pump in the station's bones cycled and fell silent and cycled again. Say it in fewer words, she said at last, the way you would say it to a soldier and not a cast. The strain never touched him, Reth said. His body switched it off on the first day and set it aside. Everything the trials measured after that he did as himself. Nothing we gave him is in any of the numbers. The Institute has spent 4 generations learning to install endurance in soldiers who cannot think, and he walked in with more of it than we have ever installed, and with a mind still attached, and the mind is the part that beat the cadreborn. Reth made himself hold her eyes. The finding is not that this human is exceptional, adjutant. That is the mistake the overseer wants everyone to make, because an exceptional anomaly can be concluded and catalogued and forgotten. The finding is that he is ordinary. A civilian, a worker. His whole world is full of him, and every one of them is stronger, raw, than the strongest thing this institute has ever built. You are certain. I am a physician. I am certain of the number and cautious about the world. But the trade on his registry is a common trade on his world, and a common trade is done by common people, and a man does not last in cold water under ice by being a legend. He lasts by being taught, young, the one thing his whole species seems to teach, that the body will kill you the moment you let it panic, and that the work is done anyway. That is not a gift we can install. It is a thing a hard world beats into its children, and then they grow up and go to work, and the work is the patient, hostile places, and they come home. Reth stopped. We have been buying them off labor markets as substrate, adjutant, and running them through cradles to install a cheaper, worse version of what they already had. I do not have a way to make that sentence smaller. Kesavor turned to the window, to the pale disk of the homeworld, and the day line crawling across the northern seas. Do you understand what this costs? She said. Not a question. The Institute is a pillar of the caste order. The premise it rests on that a soldier is a made thing, that the low material of a person is raised into worth by the shaping. That premise is older than the Institute. It is how we explain the cadre to ourselves. It is how a cadreborn's family accepts that their child came off a cradle empty. The child was raised, they tell themselves, made into something higher than a person. Your finding says the child was not raised. The child was robbed, and a worse thing was left in the space, and it would have been a better soldier if we had left it alone and simply asked. She watched the seas. I can carry a finding to my marshal that says the doctrine needs reform. I have carried harder things. I cannot easily carry one that says 4 generations of the caste order have been feeding their strongest children into a machine that made them weaker and calling it an honor. That finding does not reform the Institute. It burns the ground the Institute stands on, and there are a great many casts standing on that same ground. I know, Reth said. It is why the overseer will not let it leave the station. He cannot stop it leaving the station. I am the station's highest authority as of tonight, and the finding is already in my hand. He cannot stop the finding, Reth agreed. He can stop it meaning anything. A finding is only dangerous if it is true, and it is only provably true while the subject is alive to be tested again. If the subject is gone, concluded, expired under trial, lost to a containment event that this time succeeds, then the finding is one physician's interpretation of 11 days of anomalous data from a substrate that is no longer available for verification. The marshal's court will have 100 reasons to set it aside, and every caste standing on the old ground will hand them the reasons. The overseer does not need to refute me, adjutant. He needs the human dead, so that I cannot prove me. Kesavor was silent. Then we keep the human alive. Yes. Which he knows. She turned from the window, which is why he will not attempt it directly. He touched nothing tonight because I told him to, but a cast that old did not stop. He changed direction. He will find a way to conclude the subject that is not his hand on the instrument, a protocol, a writ, something older than my authority that I cannot simply overrule. She studied Reth. You have served him 19 years. You know the Institute's founding instruments better than I do. What does he reach for? And Reth, cold, told her, because he had already worked it out and had been hoping he was wrong. The founding writ, he said. The instrument that chartered the Institute. It has a provision no overseer has invoked in my lifetime, because no overseer has ever needed to. It holds that the doctrine of the shaping may not be declared failed, may not be reformed, retired, or ruled against, until a subject that resists the shaping has been carried to the final shaping, the maximal completion. Every measure the Institute possesses, applied at once, at the ceiling of what a body can be made to bear, witnessed by the cast, on the record, as proof that the doctrine was given its full chance before it was abandoned. Reth heard his own voice go flat. The provision exists so that no one can end the Institute cheaply, so that the doctrine cannot be killed by a bad batch or a single physician's finding. It requires that before you rule the making of soldiers a failure, you must first try at maximum to make one, and fail at that too, in front of witnesses, beyond any argument. And you believe he will invoke it. I believe he already has, or is about to. Reth met her eyes. It is the perfect instrument, adjutant. He does not have to argue with my finding. He agrees with it. He says, yes, the physician may be right, the doctrine may have failed, and precisely because the stakes are so high, the founding writ requires we attempt the final shaping before we accept it. He wraps the killing of the subject in the most solemn protocol the Institute has. He makes the maximal completion mandatory, witnessed, honorable. And the final shaping has never once been survived, because it was never designed to be survived. It was designed to be the last word. He does not need to conclude the human against your authority. He gets the founding writ to conclude the human for him, and you cannot overrule the writ, because the writ is why the Institute exists at all. Kesavor stood very still. Outside the window the day line crossed the northern seas. How long, she said, before the final shaping can be convened? The writ requires the cast be witnessed. Convening the witnesses takes time, a day, perhaps two. Reth paused. It is the only time we have, adjutant. 2 days in which the finding is true and the subject is alive and the writ has not yet closed over him. After the writ convenes, I do not have a way to stop it. It is older than both of us. Then we do not stop it, Kesavor said, and something in the banded face had gone from hunter to strategist, the look of a soldier who has stopped trying to avoid a battle and started choosing the ground for it. We win it. She looked at Reth. You told me the final shaping has never been survived. Neither had the breaking gate until 11 days ago. Neither had the cold trial or the load or the improvisation floor. Everything this institute was certain could not be survived. That man has survived in front of instruments on the record. The overseer wants to invoke the one trial the Institute designed as its last word. Her old seam caught the light. So let him convene the cast. Let him put every witness in the writ in a room to watch the doctrine's final proof, and then let them watch the same thing they have watched for 11 days, at the largest scale the Institute can build. Let them watch him fail to break a man in front of the entire order that told itself the man could be made. She turned back to the window. He thinks the final shaping is his last word, physician. I am going to make it ours. Reth went to the recovery bay in the small hours, because he needed to tell the human what was coming, and because he had learned, over 11 days, that the human would rather know the shape of the work than be spared it. Cole Tennant was awake. He was always awake. The strain that should have made rest unnecessary had been switched off, and the man simply did not sleep much in a place full of instruments, the way, Reth supposed, a diver did not sleep deep on a bad boat. He was sitting up, worn, gray at the edges from 11 days of trials, and when Reth came in he looked at him with the flat assessing calm that had stopped being unsettling and had become, somewhere in the 11 days, something Reth would have called, in a person of his own caste, trust. You've got to look, the human said. Something's coming. Something is coming, Reth agreed and told him. The founding writ, the final shaping. The maximal completion, every measure at once at the ceiling of what a body can bear, witnessed by the caste, designed as the doctrine's last word, never survived. He told it plainly, as a physician tells a patient a thing that cannot be softened, and the human listened the way he listened to everything, without flinching, taking the measure of it. Never survived, the human said when Reth was done, by anybody. By any species in the catalog. It is not a trial, Cole. The other trials measured you. This one is built to end you. The overseer is not trying to learn what you are anymore. He is trying to make certain no one else can. The human was quiet for a while. His breath went down long and out longer. On my world, he said, there's a kind of dive nobody's supposed to come back from. Deep wreck, cold, no light, lines fouled, air short. Everybody knows the number, how deep, how long, how cold, and the number says you don't come back. And every so often somebody comes back anyway. He looked at Reth. You know why? Tell me. Because the number's about the water, the human said. It's not about the guy. The number tells you exactly what the water's going to do to you, and it's always right about that. What it can't tell you is whether the guy's going to panic. That's not in the water. That's in the guy. And the number always assumes the guy panics, because almost everybody does, because panic's the fast way out and the body's screaming for it the whole way down. He breathed. Your overseer's got a number that says nobody survives his last trial, and he's right about the water, every bit of it. He built the water himself and he knows exactly what it does. The dry corner of the mouth, tired, cert. He just doesn't have a number for the guy. Nobody ever does. That's the part you don't get to measure ahead of time. You only find out after. He lay back. Tell him to convene his witnesses. I'll be there. And tell your soldier, the banded one, the adjutant, she was right about one thing. He thinks it's his last word. His eyes closed. It isn't going to be. It's just going to be the loudest the water's ever been. Same answer as always. You people are always in a hurry for a thing that only comes to people who wait. Reth stood in the low light and watched the man breathe, and understood that he had spent 19 years measuring the water and had never once, until now, thought to ask about the guy. The overseer invoked the founding writ at the turn of the next cycle, and he did it exactly as Reth had known he would, wrapped in the oldest and most solemn language the Institute possessed, so that no one hearing it could mistake the killing for anything but an honor. The invocation went out over the station's cast channels and down the jump lines to the witness holds, and Reth watched the witnesses arrive over the following day. High castes of the shaping order, slate-hided and old, come to see the doctrine given its last defense. Adjutants of 2 marshals' hands beyond Kesavors. a clerk of the conclave with the neutral gray collar of a body that recorded the cast order's decisions and enforced them. They filled the great witness gallery above the Institute's primary cradle, the deep cradle, the one Reth had cradled his most difficult shapings on, and they took their places in the tiered dark above the light, and the light below them was not the flat blue working light of the trial floors. It was the white ceremonial light of the founding, harsh and total, the light under which the Institute performed the acts it wanted the cast order to remember. Valsetha stood at the rail of the witness gallery in the full gray of an overseer of the founding, and he addressed the cast in the old language, and Reth, standing below at the cradle where his authority put him, heard the shape of the trap close, patient and complete. "We are convened," the overseer said, "under the founding writ, because a finding has been brought before this institute that the doctrine of the shaping has failed. The finding is grave. It is not brought lightly, and I do not dismiss it lightly." He inclined his head once toward Kesavor, who stood in the gallery among the witnesses with her hands loose at her sides, and toward Reth below, and the courtesy of it was worse than any insult. "A physician of this institute, of good service and sound instruments, has found that a substrate resisted the shaping, and that in resisting it outperformed our finest cadre. If this is true, the cast order must know it. If this is true, 4 generations of the shaping are called into question, and every family that gave a child to a cradle must be told what their child became. This is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing this institute has ever faced." His voice was calm, old, entirely without heat. "And precisely because it is so large, the founding writ does not permit us to rule on it in haste, or on the interpretation of a single physician, or on 11 days of anomalous data. The writ requires that before the doctrine is declared failed, the doctrine be given its full and final trial, that the substrate that resisted the shaping be carried to the final shaping, the maximal completion, every measure of the institute applied at its sealing, witnessed by this cast. So that if the doctrine fails, it fails completely in the open, beyond any argument. And so that if it does not fail, if the substrate breaks under the maximal completion as every substrate before it has broken, then the finding is answered and the doctrine stands, and the cast order need not tear itself apart over a physician's error." He let the silence hold. "I have brought us here to give the doctrine its last chance to be right. If I am wrong, the cast will see it with their own eyes, and I will accept the ruling. But we will see it. That is the writ. That is why we are convened." It was, Reth thought, standing in the white light, a masterwork. There was not a false word in it. The overseer had taken the exact truth of the situation, and folded it into an instrument that would kill the human under the color of scientific rigor, and he had done it so cleanly that half the witnesses in the gallery would leave believing they had watched the cast order be careful, and not that they had watched an old cast conclude an inconvenient man. Reth understood, with a cold clarity, why no overseer had needed to invoke the founding writ in his lifetime. It was not a weak instrument held in reserve. It was the strongest one the Institute had, and Valsetha had held it back for exactly the moment when the doctrine's death was on the table, and now he had it in his hand, and there was nothing in the Institute above it. Below the gallery, on the deep cradle in the white light, the human lay still. They had brought him down at the cycle's turn and seated him on the founding cradle, and he had let them, because letting them was the only move on the board that led anywhere but a corridor full of pacified garrison stock and a longer death. He lay in the restraints that held him because he permitted it, worn and gray and 11 days without real rest, and his eyes were open and fixed on the white light above, and he breathed down long, out longer, the slow, deliberate breath of a man doing a thing he had decided to do. "Physician," Valsetha's voice came down from the gallery, formal, for the record. "You hold the instruments of this institute under the marshal's adjutant's authority. The founding writ supersedes that authority for the duration of the final shaping. You will execute the maximal completion, every measure, at its sealing, on my mark and the cast's witness." A pause, and the old flat certainty came down through the white light like a weight. Unless the physician wishes to withdraw his finding, the writ permits it. Withdraw the finding, and there is no doctrine on trial and no final shaping, and the substrate returns to the ordinary disposition of a failed batch. The choice is the physician's. It always was. And there it was, the last exit the old caste had built into the trap, and the cruelest, because it put the human's death in Reth's hands. Withdraw the finding, and the human went back to the ordinary disposition of a failed batch, which was conclusion, which was death, only quieter off the record, with no witnesses and no doctrine at stake. Hold the finding, and the final shaping proceeded, and the human died on the founding cradle under the maximal completion, on the record, as the doctrine's proof. Either way the human died. Valsetha had built a board with no move on it that kept the man alive, and he had handed Reth the pieces, and he was waiting, in the white light, for the third-rank physician to understand that he had lost. Reth looked up at the gallery, at the tiered dark full of witnesses, at Kesavor standing among them with her hands loose and her banded face unreadable, and he did not withdraw the finding. "The finding stands, Overseer," he said, his voice carried in the white light, steadier than he felt. "Execute the final shaping." Because Kesavor had been right, and the human had been right, and Reth had spent 19 years measuring the water and had finally, in the last 2 days, thought to ask about the guy. The Overseer had built a trial designed as the doctrine's last word, a trial never survived, and he had convened the entire caste order to witness it. And the trial did not know about the guy. No trial ever did. It knew everything about the water. The Overseer had built the water himself, at its ceiling, and it would do to the human exactly what it was built to do. But whether the man broke under it was not in the water. It was in the man. And the man had told Reth, in the recovery bay, in the small hours, the one thing the Overseer's masterwork of a trap had no line for. The number is about the water. It can't tell you whether the guy panics. You only find out after. "On my mark," said Valsetha, and the caste's witness, "execute." Reth executed. He would not afterward be able to give a clean account of the final shaping, because there was no clean account to give. The maximal completion was not one thing but all things at once. Every measure the Institute possessed brought against a single body at the ceiling of what the instruments could deliver. And Reth stood at the cradle and ran them, all of them, in the order the writ demanded, and watched the water rise. They drove the strain first, harder than any trial had driven it, past the seat, past the advance, up to the ceiling where the instruments themselves began to strain, the maximal dose, the flood, the whole engineered weight of 4 generations of the shaping poured into one worn civilian at once. And the human's body did what it had done on the first day, only now it did it against a flood instead of a stream. It met the strain and studied it and quarantined it and set it aside, and the consonance meter, a new one, the founding cradle's own, built to read the deep resonances the trial floor meters could not, climbed and did not fall. The witnesses in the gallery, high castes who had come to see the doctrine defended, watched the meter climb past the red the manufacturers had painted, and Reth heard the change in the gallery, the small sounds of old castes leaning forward, because the meter climbing was the first thing many of them had ever seen that the doctrine did not predict. Then the cold at its ceiling, and the load at its ceiling layered onto the strain, all at once, the way the trials had run them one at a time now brought against the body together. And the human's body ran its 1,000 tricks, all of them in order the way it had in the cold cell, only now against everything at once gave ground, took ground, hoarded warmth at the core, bargained, adjusted, learned, the whole civilian genius of a hard world survival running at full flood against the whole engineered weight of the Institute's ceiling. He did not outmeasure the maximal completion. No body could. The water was too high. The Overseer had built it too well. But the man did not break under it either, and the not breaking was the thing the whole caste order had come to see proven impossible, and it was not being proven impossible. It was being survived, minute by minute on the record, under the white light, in front of every witness in the founding writ. Reth watched the mortality columns, and this was the part he would carry longest, the part that woke him in his quarters in the cycles that followed. Because the maximal completion did not fail all at once, it rose. And as it rose, the human's body was carried past every line Reth had ever written on a chart, past the mortality he had written down for the cold and the load and the strain, past the place where any prior subject had died, and the man did not die, and did not break, and did not panic, and the meter did not fall, and Reth understood, standing at the cradle he had cradled his hardest work on, that he was watching a thing no Vraktha had ever watched, which was a body at the absolute ceiling of what the Institute could bring against it, still deciding for itself, still there, still holding, because holding was the trade, and the man had been taught the trade young on a world that killed its children until they learned it. He should be gone, Valsetha said from the gallery. The old flat certainty had a thing in it now that Reth had never heard, a first thin crack, and Reth realized the overseer had convened the cast so certain of the water that he had never once, in all his planning, asked about the guy either. Physician, the completion is at its ceiling. He has passed every mortality in your columns. He should be gone. Advance it. The completion is already at its ceiling, overseer, Reth said. There is nothing further to advance. This is the maximal completion. This is the last word. He looked up at the gallery, at the tiered dark, at the meter climbing past the edge of its dial in front of every witness in the writ. It is the largest thing the Institute can do. And he is still here. The crack in the overseer's certainty widened, and Reth watched it happen the way he had watched 100 subjects pass the breaking gate. The moment a thing that had held its shape for a lifetime discovered that the shape was not going to hold. Only it was not the human breaking. It was Valsetha. Then take it past the ceiling, the overseer said. The words landed in the white light, and Reth felt the whole witness gallery register them. The small stillness of high castes who had come to see a solemn thing done correctly, and had just heard the overseer of the founding ask for the one thing the founding did not permit. Reth did not move. The maximal completion is the ceiling, overseer, Reth said. The founding writ defines it. Every measure the Institute possesses at its ceiling, witnessed. There is no line above it. To exceed it is not a final shaping. It is not the doctrine's last word. It is a physician driving instruments past the point the writ sanctions, on a subject the writ protects until the completion concludes, in front of the cast convened to witness the writ observed. He looked up at the gallery, and he pitched his voice to carry to the conclave clerk in the neutral gray collar, the body that recorded the cast orders' decisions and enforced them. If I take the completion past its ceiling, overseer, I am no longer executing the writ. I am violating it. And the cast is witnessing that too. He has passed every mortality in your columns, Valsetha said, and the crack was in his voice now, thin and cold and widening. He should be dead. The doctrine holds that the maximal completion is the last word because no body survives it. If a body is surviving it, physician, then the ceiling was set too low. Raise it. That is the finding the doctrine requires, not that the man is strong, that the instrument was weak. Raise the ceiling and complete the shaping and end this. And there it was, the last retreat of a certainty that would not die. Not that the human was extraordinary, not that the doctrine had failed, but that the instruments themselves must be inadequate, that there must be a higher ceiling, that if only the water were driven higher the man would break as the doctrine promised. Reth had heard the overseer say recalibrate the instrument on the first day, when the consonance meter climbed past its dial, and here it was again at the end, the same word wearing its final and most terrible clothes. The overseer would rather believe every instrument in the Institute was faulted than believe the man on the cradle was simply more than the doctrine had a shape for. He would drive the water up and up, past the writ, past the ceiling, past any line, until either the man broke or the man died, because a dead man could be catalogued and a broken man could be a soldier, and the one outcome the overseer could not survive was a live man breathing his slow breath on the founding cradle in front of the cast, while the meter climbed past its dial. "No," Reth said. The word was very quiet, and it carried in the white light because there was nothing else in the room to compete with it. Only the patient tick of the meter against its pin, and the slow, long breath of the man on the cradle. "I will not raise the ceiling," Reth said. "The ceiling is the ceiling. The writ is the writ. The maximal completion has been executed, in full, witnessed by this cast, at every measure the Institute possesses, and the subject is alive." He turned from the cradle to face the gallery fully, a third-rank physician in the white light of the founding, and he said the thing he had come 19 years to say and had not known, until this cycle, that he had been walking toward. The founding writ required that the doctrine be given its final trial before it could be declared failed. The doctrine has been given its final trial. This is it. This is the maximal completion at its ceiling, and the subject who resisted the shaping has survived it, whole himself, in front of the cast convened to witness. The writ has been satisfied. And its answer is not the one the overseer promised you. He looked up into the tiered dark at the high casts leaning forward, at the two adjutants of marshals' hands, at the conclave clerk with the recording collar. The doctrine failed, not because the physician erred, because the man did not break. You came to witness the doctrine's last word. You are witnessing it. This is what it says. The silence in the witness gallery was total. And then Valsetha did the last thing. The thing a cast that old and that close to losing everything he had built could not stop himself from doing. And it was the thing that ended him. He reached past Reth. He invoked, over his own authority as overseer of the founding, a direct instrument command to the founding cradle, a thing an overseer could do in extremity to override a physician at the instruments. And he drove the completion up himself, past the ceiling, past the writ, past the line, his own old hands on the command, because if the physician would not raise the water, then the overseer would raise it, and the cast could witness that too, and let them see the doctrine given every chance. Let them see the man broken at last, at whatever height it took. The water rose past the ceiling. Reth felt it go, felt the instruments strain past the place they were built to reach, and on the founding cradle the human's body met a thing no body in the catalog had ever been made to bear, a completion driven past the writ's own last word, and the man's slow, long breath caught, for the first time in 11 days, and held, and did not come. The meter fell. Reth saw it fall, and something in his chest went to ice, because the meter falling was the thing that had never once happened in 11 days, the thing that meant the argument was ending, the thing that meant the self was losing, and the whole gallery saw it fall. And for one white frozen instant the overseer's certainty was vindicated. The man was breaking. The doctrine held. The water driven high enough would drown anyone, even this. And then Reth understood what he was looking at, and he moved. The meter was not falling because the man was breaking. It was falling because the man was dying. There was a difference, and it was the whole difference, and no one in the Institute had ever needed to know it before, because in every prior subject the breaking and the dying had been the same event. The self did not lose the argument. The body under the completion driven past its ceiling was simply failing, all at once, the way even the strongest thing fails when a hand drives the water past every line. And the self was not surrendering. The self was going down, still arguing, still there, still deciding, as the body it lived in was killed out from under it by an old caste who could not bear to be wrong. Reth killed the command. He did it against the overseer's override, which a third-rank physician could not do, except that Kesavor had been moving from the moment the meter fell down out of the witness gallery, past the rail, onto the cradle floor, and she reached the instruments the same instant Reth did and put the full weight of a war adjutant of the marshal's hand behind his hand on the command. And between them they broke the overseer's override and dropped the water, all of it, off the ceiling, off the completion, down to nothing. And the founding cradle went quiet. On the cradle, the human's chest did not move. Reth had brought subjects back from the edge of the cold trials, and he did the things a physician does, fast, in the white light, with Kesavor's hand steadying the instruments and the whole cast watching from the tiered dark. And for a long, terrible stretch there was nothing, only the meter flat and the chest still, and the worn gray body of a civilian who had survived every measure the Institute possessed and been killed anyway by a man who could not accept the survival. And then the human breathed. Down long, out longer, the slow, deliberate breath of a body that had gone all the way to the bottom of the cold, dark water and decided, at the bottom, that the water did not get to say when he was done. His chest rose. The meter twitched off the flat and climbed and did not fall, and the man on the founding cradle opened his eyes to the white light and found Reth's face above him and said, in the flat, cracked voice, barely a thread of sound, the thing that Reth would carry out of the Institute and into every cycle of the life that came after. Told you, the human breathed. Water's patient, a pause to find the air. He got in a hurry. The witness gallery did not erupt. Reth had half expected it to, some cast sound of outrage or awe. It did not come, because the thing the cast had witnessed was too large for sound. They had convened under the oldest instrument the Institute possessed to see the doctrine given its final defense, and they had watched a worn civilian of a deathworld survive the maximal completion whole. And then they had watched the overseer of the founding, unable to bear the surviving, drive the completion past the writ's own ceiling, a violation on the record, in front of the conclave clerk, and nearly kill the subject the writ protected, and fail even at that. Because the man had come back off the bottom breathing his slow breath, there was nothing to shout about. There was only the doctrine, lying on the white floor in front of the whole cast order, dead, and the man who had killed it breathing quietly on the cradle, and the old overseer standing at the gallery rail with his hands still on a command that no longer did anything. The conclave clerk rose first. The neutral gray collar of a body that recorded the cast order's decisions and enforced them, and when it spoke, its voice was flat and precise and final, and it addressed itself not to the overseer but to the record. Let it be recorded, the clerk said, that the founding writ was convened and satisfied. The doctrine of the shaping was given its final trial at the maximal completion, witnessed by this cast, and the subject who resisted it survived whole. Let it be further recorded that the overseer of the founding did, in the presence of these witnesses, exceed the ceiling defined by the writ in violation of the instrument he himself invoked, and did thereby endanger the subject the writ protects. The writ has ruled, the doctrine has failed, and the failure was witnessed to be complete. The gray collar turned once toward Valsetha, and the flatness in its voice was worse than any anger. Overseer, take your hands off the command. You are relieved of the founding. The conclave will convene on the disposition of this institute and on your own. Until it does, you will touch nothing. Valsetha took his hands off the command. He did it slowly, an old cast at the end of a lifetime's certainty, and for a moment Reth almost pitied him, because the overseer had not been a cruel thing so much as a certain one, and the certainty had been the whole of him. And now the certainty was dead on the white floor, and there was nothing left in the old cast but the shape the certainty had left behind. He looked, Reth thought, like a cadreborn holding a mark after it had gone dark. He looked like a made thing whose instruction had finally stopped coming. The overseer looked down at the human on the cradle, and the human, impossibly, was looking back at him, worn to a thread, half-dead, eyes clear. You should have broken, Valsetha said. It was the first thing he had said in 11 days that was not certain. It came out almost as a question. Yeah, the human breathed, down long, out longer. People keep telling me that. The doctrine died on the white floor of the founding cradle, and Reth was foolish enough, for most of a cycle, to believe that killing the doctrine had made the man safe. It had done the opposite. A doctrine is only as dangerous as its proof, and the proof was a worn civilian breathing his slow breath in a recovery bay. And there were a great many casts in the surveyed volume who would sleep better with the proof concluded. Kesavor came to Reth in the recovery bay before the conclave convened, and she did not stand this time. She sat heavily in the manner of a soldier who has been awake through a battle and is not yet allowed to stop, and she watched the human sleep. He was sleeping, finally, for the first time in 11 days, the deep still sleep of a body that has decided the water has gone quiet enough to allow it, and she spoke low so as not to wake him. "You think the worst is behind us," she said. "It is not. You killed the doctrine in front of the caste, and now the caste has a problem it did not have this morning. This morning the Institute made soldiers and the caste order rested on the making. Tonight the Institute makes nothing, and every caste that stood on that ground is standing on air, and there is exactly one thing in the surveyed volume that can push the ground back under their feet." She nodded at the sleeping man. "His death. If he dies quietly, of his injuries, of a containment event, of anything the record can bear, then the finding is one physician's interpretation of data from a substrate no longer available for verification, exactly as your overseer planned. The conclave sets it aside, the old ground holds, the Institute is reformed, not raised, a great many powerful castes go on being what they were." She met Reth's eyes. "He is more dangerous to the caste order asleep in this bay than he ever was on the cradle. On the cradle he was a datum, now he is a witness. And the caste order has always known what to do with a witness." "The conclave clerk recorded the finding," Reth said. "It is in the record." "The record can be sealed. Findings are sealed all the time for the stability of the caste order, for the good of the many, for reasons a clerk will write in language no one argues with. A sealed finding is a finding that never happened, and a dead witness cannot unseal it." She leaned forward. "I have seen this done, physician. I have carried the orders myself before I understood what I was carrying. A truth too large for the caste order to survive is not refuted. It is buried with the one who proved it, and the caste order goes on. That is the disposition the conclave will reach for, because it is the disposition that costs them least, and they will call it prudence, and half of them will believe it." Her old seam caught the low light. "So we are not going to let them reach the seal. We are going to make the finding too large to bury. We are going to make the man worth more to the caste order alive than dead, and we are going to do it before the conclave convenes, because the moment they convene, the safest thing on the table will be his conclusion, and safe is what frightened castes choose." "How?" Reth said. "By changing what he is." Kesavor sat back. "Right now he is a proof can be buried. We are going to make him a soldier the marshal cannot afford to lose, not a made one, a recruited one, the first of a thing the marshal needs more than the caste order needs its comfort. The marshal is losing a war. The marshal has watched his made columns die in perfect formation for years and has been told by every caste on the old ground that the answer is more shaping, better shaping, a stronger strain. Tonight I can tell him the answer is a worn civilian who talked a cadreborn down with an open hand and survived the maximal completion hole. I can tell him where such civilians come from and how many of them there are. And a marshal who is losing a war will choose the thing that wins it over the comfort of the caste order every time, because a marshal who loses the war does not get to enjoy the comfort." She rose. "The caste order wants him dead so the old ground holds. The marshal will want him alive so the war is won. I am going to get to the marshal before the conclave gets to the seal. And you, physician, are going to give me the one thing that makes the argument for me." "What thing?" "The other subjects." Kesavor looked at him. "You said his whole world is full of him. You said the trade on his registry is a common trade done by common people. The caste order can bury one witness. It cannot bury a source. If the finding is a single anomaly, it dies with the man. If the finding is a door, a whole world of civilians stronger raw than our finest cadre, available not as substrate to be broken but as soldiers to be asked, then the man is not the proof anymore. He is the first of a supply the Marshal cannot live without. And you do not seal a door, physician, you walk through it. She moved toward the bay entrance. Write me the door, not the anomaly. The door. Give me the finding that makes his death a loss the Marshal will not pay, and do it fast. The conclave convenes at the cycle's turn, and frightened casts do not keep late hours before a hard decision. Reth wrote the door. He wrote it the way he had written every finding, plainly, as a physician writes, but this time he wrote past the single subject to the thing behind the subject, and the thing behind the subject was the largest finding of his life. He wrote that the human was not exceptional. He wrote that the trade on the registry was common, and that a common trade meant common practitioners, and that a world which taught its ordinary workers to last in cold water under ice had a population, not an outlier. He wrote that every gain the Institute had spent 4 generations, and a war's treasure trying to install, the endurance that climbed, the body that learned, the improvisation that outfought a cadreborn was standard equipment on an ordinary member of that species, plus the self the Institute had learned to break, and that the self was the part that won. He wrote that the Marshal's war was being lost by made soldiers who could not think, and that the answer had been sitting in the labor markets the whole time, bought and broken as substrate, when it should have been recruited whole. He wrote the door, and he did not soften it, and at the end of it he wrote the sentence that would either save the man's life or seal it, depending on whether it reached a war loser before it reached a frightened caste. The Marshal does not need a better shaping. The Marshal needs to stop making soldiers and start asking them. The strongest army available to the caste order is the one it has been buying by the crate and wrecking on cradles. Leave them whole and ask. He rooted it to Kesavor, and Kesavor took it, and jumped for the Marshal's hand before the conclave convened, and Reth stayed on the station with a sleeping man and a relieved overseer and a caste order deciding, 3 jumps away, whether the safest thing to do with the truth was to bury it. The human woke while she was gone. He woke the way he did everything, without fuss, his breath going from the deep, slow rhythm of sleep to the deliberate rhythm of a man awake and taking the measure of the room, and he found Reth at the instruments and lay still a while, and then he said, "It's not over." "No," Reth said. "There is a body, the conclave, that will decide what to do with what happened. And the safest thing for them to decide is that it did not happen, which requires that you not be here to say it did. They want me dead, flat, not afraid, a diver reading a gauge, not the old one, the whole thing above him. Because I'm the proof, and proof's inconvenient." "Yes." "And the banded one, the adjutant, she went to make me worth more alive than dead." "Yes." The human was quiet a while. His breath went down long and out longer. "Where I'm from," he said, "when a company doesn't want to pay out on a wreck, they don't argue the wreck sank. They argue the diver did something wrong, went too deep, cut the wrong line, wasn't rated, makes the whole thing his fault, and then they don't owe anybody anything and the wreck's just a wreck." He looked at the ceiling plate. "Your conclave's going to argue I did something wrong, or that I'm not what the number says, or that the number's faulted, same as the old one did on the first day. Recalibrate the instrument, the dry corner of the mouth. It's always the same move. Nobody ever wants the finding. They want the finding to have made a mistake. The adjutant believes she can make you worth more to the Marshal, then the finding is dangerous to the caste." "Maybe," the human considered it, "but I'm not going to be his soldier, doctor. I want to be real clear about that because she's going to come back and she's going to have made a deal, and the deal's going to have me in it as a thing the Marshal keeps. I'm not a thing anybody keeps." He said it without heat, the flattest and most certain thing Reth had heard him say. "I'll help her make the argument that keeps me alive. I'll tell the truth to whoever needs to hear it. But the second the deal turns me into a weapon, there's instead of the old ones, I'm right back where I started, and I didn't survive your last trial to end up a nicer version of the thing it was trying to make me." He turned his head and looked at Reth. "You understand the difference. You're the only one here who might. There's a thing they keep trying to turn me into, and it doesn't matter whether they do it with a strain or a commission or a war they need one. It's the same thing. Somebody deciding what I'm for, and the whole reason I'm still me is I never once let anybody else be the one who decides that. His breath down long out longer. Not the water, not the old one, not the adjutant either when she gets back with her deal. Me. That's the finding, doctor. Write that one down. Everything else is just the number. Reth looked at the man a long moment, and then he did a thing he had not done in 19 years at the Institute, a thing no physician of the shaping did, because the whole architecture of the Institute rested on the opposite of it. I will not write you into anyone's deal, Reth said. I will write the door, and the door is true, and the marshal may walk through it or the cast may seal it, and that is the cast order's business. But you are not the door. You are the man who proved it exists. And when the adjutant comes back with her deal, physician's authority is worth exactly one thing in this institute, and I am going to spend it on making certain the deal has a way out of it that is yours to take. He paused. Where I come from, that is not a thing a cast does for a substrate. I have spent my life on the wrong side of a mistake so large I did not have a word for it until you lay down on my cradle and refused to become smaller. This is the beginning of paying it. It is not the whole of it, but it is the beginning. The human looked at him, and the flat assessing calm held for a moment, and then it changed into a thing Reth had not seen on the human's face in 11 days. A thing worn and tired, and for the first time, not entirely without warmth. Okay, Cole Tennant said. Then we'll do it your way, doctor. Slow, careful, don't panic. The dry corner of the mouth, closer to a real smile than it had ever come. You're getting the hang of the trade. Kesavor came back from the marshal's hand before the conclave reached its seal, and she came back with the one thing that could stop a frightened cast order from burying a truth, which was a hungrier authority that wanted the truth alive. The conclave had convened in the Institute's high chamber, under the daylight that fell through the great dome from the pale disk of the homeworld, and Reth was called to it as the physician of record, and the human was called to it as the subject, carried in on a recovery cradle because he could not yet stand for long, worn to the bone but awake, breathing his slow, deliberate breath, his eyes moving across the tiered ranks of high castes the way they had moved across the trial floor on the first day. Taking the measure of the room, weighing the exits, reading which of the assembled powers wanted him dead. Most of them did. Reth could see it in the set of the old slate hides, the careful neutrality that a caste wears when it has already decided a thing, and is only waiting for the language to make the deciding respectable. The finding was too large. The old ground was cracking under a great many powerful feet, and there was one small, worn, inconvenient body in the room whose conclusion would push the ground back where it belonged, and the conclave had come to find the language that would let them push. The conclave clerk began to read the disposition, and the disposition began the way Reth had known it would, in the measured language of prudence and the good of the many and the stability of the caste order. And Reth understood that he was listening to the opening of a seal, and that in a moment the clerk would reach the part where the finding was set aside for verification that could never occur because the subject would not survive to provide it. And Kesavor walked into the high chamber, in the gray of the marshal's office, with the collar marks of her hand, and a thing behind her that changed the temperature of the room. Behind her walked a bearer of the marshal's own seal. The conclave will pause its disposition, Kesavor said, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to, because the seal behind her did the raising. The marshal of the Ninth Front has read the physician's finding, all of it, the anomaly and the door, and the marshal has an instruction for this conclave that supersedes the disposition it was about to reach, and I am to deliver it before the seal is set, because the marshal was very clear that the seal must not be set. She let the silence hold, and the assembled high castes, who a moment ago had been reaching for the comfort of the old ground, went still in the way of powerful creatures who have just felt a larger predator enter the range. The marshal is losing a war. The marshal has buried 11 years of made soldiers who could not think, and has been told by every caste in this chamber that the answer is a better shaping. Tonight the Marshal has been shown that the answer is not a better shaping. The answer is that we have been buying the answer by the crate and breaking it on cradles, and the Marshal would like it to stop. Her old seam caught the daylight from the dome. The finding will not be sealed. The subject will not be concluded. The Institute's mandate is suspended, effective at the Marshal's word, pending its reconstitution, not as a house that makes soldiers, but as a house that finds them. And the physician of record, she looked at Reth, and something in the banded face that was almost, but not quite, a smile, is reassigned to the Marshal's hand to build the finding into a doctrine of the door. The Marshal has a war to win and no more children to feed to cradles and a great many worlds full of people who last. The high castes did not erupt. They did the thing frightened powerful castes do when a larger power has closed off the safe road. They recalculated in silence in the daylight, each of them arriving at the same conclusion, which was that the old ground had cracked and would not be pushed back, and that the creatures who survived the cracking of old ground were the ones who found new ground fastest. Reth watched the recalculation move through the chamber, and understood that the war loser had beaten the comfort keepers, exactly as Kesavor had said he would, because a Marshal who loses the war does not get to enjoy the comfort, and every caste in the chamber served, in the end, a Marshal. The seal was not set. The finding lived, and the small, worn, inconvenient body on the recovery cradle, which the whole conclave had wanted concluded an hour before, was now the first proof of a doctrine the Marshal needed to win a war, and there is no safer thing in the surveyed volume than a proof a Marshal cannot afford to lose. They gave the human a name in the record, and it was not substrate. The conclave, having recalculated, moved with the speed of castes eager to be seen on the new ground, and within a cycle the disposition had been rewritten, and Valsethas alongside it. The old overseer was not executed. The Vraktha did not execute a caste that old for being certain, only for exceeding the writ, and the exceeding was recorded, and its price was exacted in the only currency an overseer of the founding truly owned, which was the founding itself. He was relieved, permanently, of the doctrine he had spent a lifetime defending, and he was made to witness its reconstitution, which Reth understood, watching the old caste stand at the rail of a chamber that no longer answered to him, was a heavier sentence than any the conclave could have written. The certainty had been the whole of him. Now he would live a long time in the space where the certainty had been, the way a Cadreborn lived in the space where a self had been, and Reth found that he pitied the old caste after all, and found also that the pity did not move him to spare the old caste the sentence, and understood that this was a thing he had learned from the man on the cradle. You could pity the thing on the leash and still go after the hand that held it. The two were not in conflict. He had spent 19 years believing they were. Kesavor brought the deal to the human on the third day, when he could sit up on his own, and she brought it plainly, because she had learned, as Reth had, that the man would rather know the shape of the work than be handed it soft. The Marshal wants you, she said, not as substrate, as the first, a commission, a rank, a place at the head of the doctrine you proved. You would be the model, the proof the caste order builds the new army on. You would want for nothing, and you would never see a cradle again, and you would be, for the rest of a long life, the most valuable soldier in the surveyed volume. She watched him. It is the best offer the caste order has ever made a member of your species. And I already know you are going to refuse it, because I have spent 12 days watching you refuse to be made into things, and I would think less of you if you stopped now. So refuse it, and then tell me what you want instead, and I will carry that to the Marshal too, because the Marshal owes you a war he did not know he could win, and a Marshal pays his debts. The human was quiet a while. His breath went down long and out longer. I want to go home, he said. That's the whole of it. I'm not a soldier. I never was. I go in cold water after wrecks, and there are people on my boat who don't know if I'm alive, and there are people on my world who don't know your raiders are out here buying us by the crate to break us on tables. I want to go home, and I want to tell them. He looked at her flat, "Sir. And I want the buying to stop. That's the real thing. Not a commission, not a rank. You want my world to fight your war for you. Maybe some of us will and maybe some of us won't, and that's a thing you'll have to ask us, one at a time like people, because that's the whole finding, isn't it? You stop taking us and you start asking us. But the taking stops first, before any asking. The raiders that pulled me off that tug and sold me here, they stop. My world gets told what's been happening to the ones who went missing. And whoever wants to come fight your war after that comes as themselves, whole, deciding for themselves, and walks home after if they want to walk home." He breathed. "That's the deal, Adjutant. Not me at the head of your army. The taking stops, the asking starts, and I go home and tell the truth. You can build whatever doctrine you want on that. But it starts with you letting me off the boat." Kesavor looked at him a long moment, and then she inclined her head, the deep motion, one hunter to another, the recognition a warrior line gave a thing it had measured and found real. "The taking stops," she said. "I will carry it to the marshal in those words, and the marshal will sign it, because the marshal needs the asking to work, and the asking does not work on a world we are still raiding. Your world will be told. The raiders on your fields will be pulled off them. The marshal's hand reaches further than a labor market, and a marshal who wants an ally does not let his own crews keep robbing it." She rose. "And you will go home. On a marshal's ship, not a raider's manifest. It is a long way, and you are not yet strong enough to make it, but you will be, and when you are, you will go." A pause. "You could have had a commission and a rank and the whole caste order at your back. And you asked instead for a smaller thing than any of it, which was to be left alone, and a larger thing than all of it, which was for us to stop breaking your people. I have served a long time, and I have not often met a soldier who understood the difference. You are not a soldier." Her old seam caught the light. "Which is precisely why you are the one the marshal should have been asking for all along." Reth did not go with him to the ship at first, and then he did. He had been reassigned to the marshal's hand, to build the finding into a doctrine, and there was a lifetime of work in it, a whole civilization's understanding of soldiers to take apart and put back together, the way the human's body took apart the strain and set it aside, and Reth threw himself into it, because it was the beginning of paying a debt he did not have a word large enough for. He wrote the door into a doctrine. He wrote that a soldier was not a made thing. He wrote that the endurance the Institute had spent 4 generations installing was standard equipment on the worlds the caste order had been raiding, and that the self the Institute had learned to break was the part that won, and that the whole architecture of the shaping had been the patient wrecking of better soldiers than it could build. He wrote it plainly, as a physician writes, and it would be argued over for a long time, and some of it would be sealed after all, and some of it would change how a civilization thought about what a person was for. That was the caste order's business. Reth's business was that it was true and that he had put it in ink. But when the ship was ready and the human was strong enough, Reth found that he could not let the man leave on a marshal's ship among marshal's crews without one face aboard that had stood at the foot of his cradle on the first day. And so he requested passage, and the request was granted, because a physician of the marshal's hand who wished to observe the first repatriation of the doctrine's proof was a reasonable thing. And because Kesavor signed it without comment, and with something in the banded face that Reth chose not to name. The Cadraborn came too, in a manner of speaking. Not aboard. The made soldiers could not be unmade, and Reth had spent long cycles with that grief. The knowledge that the ones already off the cradles were empty for good, that no doctrine of the door could give a self back to a thing the shaping had hollowed. But the one the human had talked down on the amber deck, the one he had called to safety with an open hand, that one the marshal's hand had pulled from the garrison rolls and set to a different work, guarding, tending, the simple instructed labors a made soldier could still do, and it lived, and it was not thrown into a grinder in perfect formation. And when the human learned of it, he was quiet a long while and then said only, "Good." He didn't ask to be what they made him. None of them did. It was the closest the man came, in all the time Reth knew him, to grief of his own. He grieved the maid soldiers the way he had grieved the cadreborn on the trial floor, stopping in the middle of his own hard survival to mourn the thing standing empty beside him. And Reth came to understand that this too was the finding, the part the instruments could never read. That the strongest thing the human carried was not the enduring. It was that the enduring had not cost him the mercy. The Institute had believed you had to break a person to make a soldier, and the man had proved you did not. And the proof was not that he survived the cradle. The proof was that he came off it still able to pity the ones who had not. Home was a long way, and Reth spent the passage learning the man, because the doctrine he was building had a hole in the middle of it, the shape of a question no instrument could answer, and the man was the only place the answer lived. He asked once near the end of the passage, the question he had carried since the first day, since the consonance meter bent against its pin. How? Reth said. Not the trade I understand now, the cold water, the not panicking, the deciding that the water does not get to say when you are done. I understand the trade. What I do not understand is where a person learns to hold it against the maximal completion, against a thing built to take you apart. The trade is for the water. The founding cradle was not the water. It was the whole of the Institute at its ceiling meant to end you, and you held the trade against it anyway. How? The human thought about it a long time, the way he thought about everything, and when he answered, he did not answer the way Reth expected, with strength or defiance or the deathworld pride the cast catalog would have predicted. Because it was the same, Cole said. That's the part your people never got, all the way down to the old one on the cradle. You kept building bigger water, colder, heavier, more of it all at once up past the ceiling. And you thought at some point the water would get so big it'd be a different thing, and the trade wouldn't work on it anymore, and I'd finally panic like everybody else. He watched the pale point of a star that was not yet his sun. But it's never a different thing, it's just more water. The cold cell was water, and the founding cradle was water, and the old one driving it past the ceiling was water, louder. But the answer's the same answer it's always been, since the first time somebody handed me a line and pointed at the dark and said the number says you don't come back. You decide the water doesn't get to say when you're done. And then you do the work. And you don't let any of it, the cold, the dark, the old one's hands on the command, the whole cast order wanting you gone, you don't let any of it move you one bit faster than the work needs. He breathed down long, out longer. Your people spent 4 generations trying to build a soldier that couldn't be moved. And the whole time the thing you were trying to build, we just call it going to work. The dry corner of the mouth. That's the finding, Doctor. It was never a better soldier. It was just a guy who wouldn't panic. And you'd been drowning them by the crate because you thought the panic was the useful part. Reth wrote that down too. It was the truest line in the doctrine, and it was the one that would be argued over longest, and it was the one that was going to change what a civilization thought a person was for. They came to the human's world at the end of a long fall through daylight, a blue and violent and beautiful ordeal tier world that the cast catalog had ranked at the top of a very short and very unpleasant list, and the man stood at the port of the marshal's ship and looked down at it. Worn, healed himself. And for the first time in the whole time Reth had known him, his slow, deliberate breath came a little faster, and Reth understood that it was not fear. It was the only thing that had ever made the man's breath quicken. It was home. They'll ask where I've been, Cole said, not turning from the port. The ones on my boat, my world, and I'll tell them all of it. The cradle, the trials, the old one, the taking. And they'll do something about the ones who are still missing because that's what my world does. Somebody goes under and doesn't come back, we go in after them. He looked at Reth. You want to ask us to fight your war. Some of us will, not because you built us for it. Because you finally stopped taking and started asking, and because there are worse things in the dark than your marshal's soul, and my world has never once been able to leave a thing in the dark alone. The dry corner of the mouth, closer to a real smile than it had ever come. You didn't make a better soldier, Doctor. You just met one, and had the sense to stop cutting him open and ask him his name. Reth stood at the port beside the man he had first signed for with a hooked stroke of a stylus, substrate on a manifest raw material for the ninth shaping, and he watched the blue world come up to meet them, and he thought about the water, and about a needle that would not fall, and about 19 years of measuring the wrong thing. Coal Tenant, Reth said. It was the first time he had spoken the name aloud. Hull diver, cold water rated, rescue endorsement. He paused. It was on the registry the whole time. I signed for you and did not read it because the manifest images never mattered and the trade never mattered and the name never mattered because we did not buy names. We bought substrate. He looked at the man. I have your name now. The whole cast order has it. It is the first line of a doctrine that is going to stop us buying anyone by the crate ever again. I do not know if that is a thing you can forgive. I do not ask you to. But it is a thing that would not have been true if you had broken on my cradle like the doctrine promised, and you did not break, and so it is true, and so I will carry it the rest of my life. He inclined his head, the deep motion, the recognition of an equal met across open ground, the first time a physician of the Institute had ever made it to a man he had once called raw material. Go home. Do the work. Do not panic. The man laughed. A short, rough, surprised sound, the first laugh Reth had heard from him, and it was worth more than any number the instruments had taken. And then the ship touched the world that had made him, and the port opened onto a sky full of violent weather and hard light, the sky of a world that killed its children until they learned not to panic and then sent them out to go to work. And Coal Tenant walked down into it on his own 2 feet, worn and whole and entirely himself, a civilian. A diver, a man who lasted. Behind him, the doctrine of the shaping lay dead in the record of a distant station, and a new doctrine was being written in a physician's plain hand, and it did not say that humanity was stronger, or faster, or more durable, because none of those were true and all of them missed the finding. It said a smaller and larger thing than any of that, the thing the old cast had driven the water past its ceiling rather than believe. The thing the whole surveyed volume was going to spend a long time learning to live beside. They had tried to make him into a weapon, and he had declined and walked home, and that, not the strength, not the surviving, but the walking home unbroken and unbought and still able to pity the ones who could not, was the thing they had never once known how to build, and had finally, at the cost of everything they were certain of, learned they had only ever needed to ask for.